Underdevelopment is itself a development. Modern office buildings and luxury hotels in the capital city instead of housing for the poor. Cosmetic surgery clinics for the affluent instead of hospitals for workers. Cash export crops for agribusiness instead of food for local markets. Highways that go from the mines to the latifundios and the refineries and ports instead of roads in the backcountry for those who might hope to see a doctor or a teacher. Profit is rational, welfare is not. The development of capital is the industrial production of such ideas which find their home in everyday living. It is then not the development of capital, but of society itself. It is discovered in the mundane that the subject is already culture, enlightenment is already myth. Gulags, concentration camps, communist totalitarianism, as opposed to, of course, it's funny G word, as opposed to drone striking families in the third world, as opposed to billionaires taking joyrides in space while children starve. To the average first worlder faced with decaying capitalism and the fear of communism, they must then conclude both systems suck, and the world should implode and the human race erased from history. I guess there is no alternative. Everything has already happened. Non-time becomes non-being. Being becomes decay, mass surveillance, economic imperialism, artificial poverty reinforces the fact that the entire human race is nothing compared to a single system. The state continues after the monarch, but capital persists after every living organism has died. Merely the image of a living organism is sufficient for the non-reality that capital desires. Everything is derivative. Foucault introduces the radical 60s beautifully in his preface to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, which is really where the story of capitalist realism begins, the 60s. Quote, "Then came the 5 brief, impassioned, jubilant, enigmatic years. At the gates of our world, there was, of course, Vietnam and the first major blow to the powers that be. But here, inside our walls, what exactly was taking place? An amalgam of revolutionary and anti-repressive politics, a war fought on 2 fronts against social exploitation and psychic repression, a surge of libido modulated by class struggle? Perhaps. At any rate, it is this familiar, dualistic interpretation that has laid claim to the events of those years. The dream that cast its spell between the First World War and fascism. Over the dreamiest parts of Europe, the Germany of Wilhelm Reich and the France of the Surrealists had returned and set fire to reality itself, Marx and Freud in the same incandescent light. From the beginning, Marxism set out to place a mirror in front of every man and say to them, when children slave in the mines and whole cities are burned for money, when all the austerity has been done, when the poor have been plundered, when the farmland is at last barren and dry, then the fascists knock. What life is this to live? Since George Lukacs' theory of reification or even Marxist superstructure, Marxism was doomed to repeat the same thesis over and over in vain. Nothing new can arise, for there is nothing more to reveal. Even anti-Oedipus is but a momentary gasp, and then the same old linear thinking annexes once again. The horrifying truth that capitalism is an incoherent monstrosity only leading to death and destruction has long since ceased to even be horrifying. We are no longer in the process of losing the idea of a human. Now the idea has never existed in the first place. And not just in Lacanian terms, but in universal objective terms, which is the language of modernity. Truth is so repetitive that it no longer possesses any potential or qualities it previously had. Illusion has thus come to inherit what truth once was. Feeling and passion is now contained within the status quo of consumerism. There's a saying about how disposable workers are. You're not a cog. You're not even ball bearing. You're the grease, designed to be replaced and reapplied regularly. Everything is doomed, has been doomed. Corpses of alienated consumers reanimated again and again, dead art and nullified realities strung up by strings. Maybe there is no future to win, no past to reclaim, and maybe the present is etched into stone. Maybe millions starve the land and the communities will never truly be recovered. A colonialist past, a capitalist future, a bygone present. Neoliberalism is indeed at its height, and therefore also its twilight. It is immovable and therefore all the more fearful of being moved. The foundations set by figures before us are still there laying dormant. It is by the contribution and effort of millions that something finally sits upon that foundation at last. That effort is not easy, but such is the philosophy of living. I now provide 3 statements to begin this text. Fascism is not the future nor the past. It is not a concept at all, not to the fascists themselves, nor to fascism itself. 1. Inhumanity reigns whether you collapse reality or not. In fact, the more it is deconstructed, the more we see that the surface is all there is, if reality ever existed in the first place. 2. Indeed, it has become suffocatingly apparent. Being itself is already decay. 3. Every act is an absolute negation imploding within itself. 4. Every thought is already dead before the moment of conception and will remain so. 5. Every experience annihilates itself endlessly and continuously. 6. Every moment becomes suffocating from all this negation, death, and nihilistic renewal. 7. Heaven forbid the oppressed have a single gulp of air.
We all know why we're here. It's time to declare an all-out war, to mobilize our forces, public and private, national and local, in a total, coordinated assault upon this menace, which is draining our economy of some $230 billion.
The war on drugs. In 1986, America's #1 concern. In an election year, the enemy is everywhere. The familiar.
Money is not your god. It is a sacrificial totem. Nature presented us with a defunct god, an imperfection, a near omnipotence, but not an omniscience. God as nature could be overcome, mastered, and subjugated. Its immovability is merely that of a heavy boulder, and most importantly, it lacks a clear will. It is terrifying only in the sense that the self proclaims itself to be terrified, allows itself to be subjugated under nature's rule. Nature is beautiful only in the sense that the culture erases, declares it to be so. Nature's control is only that of the most general, the macro, the economic, the cultural, never the individual, never the finest of details. The Christian God is even less powerful. It only consists in the churches and in the faith of its followers, nothing more. Its economic and political influence is only secondary, non-essential, mere accessory. But as Foucault's Discipline and Punish explains, the monistic discipline becomes fully realized in modern times, or as I call it, God perfected. Capital. A perfected God does not ask his followers for belief. Belief must precede existence itself. Belief means reality exists. Quote, unlike the soul represented by Christian theology, it is not born in sin and subject to punishment, but is born rather out of methods of punishment, supervision, and constraint. This God becomes omniscient because every follower carries with them a piece of it everywhere they go. It is all powerful, for it commands every detail of every day of every individual. This God is totalitarian, and we are all the more happy for it. Its will is violently made clear to those who inquire even the slightest amount. Nothing, absolutely nothing, but its own self-preservation for no purpose and no goal. Its immensity is not even immense but unquestioned, immovability in the fact that no one even dares to try to move it. And all those that do try become Sisyphean in their endless, repetitive task, which makes the God all the more immovable. This God has subjugated nature in exploiting it, has also subjugated Christian God as just another less powerful derivative of itself. This God becomes every privatized war, every economic merger or acquisition, every consumer product made by cheap foreign labor, every algorithm tracking your every move. It becomes every event that has, will, or is happening. It becomes every object and human in the flow of capital. It becomes the God of gods. Spinoza's prophecy is thus finally realized under industrial rule, as he declared, God is the laws of physics, which itself becomes omniscient, for it is everything. Capital is the culmination of the human project. It is the first ever successful attempt at replicating and mastering human culture and social life. This human creation can therefore finally declare itself to be God perfected. Done to nature and ourselves. Let's take the example of the cow. From literally the first result of Google, we already get a haunting image. Quote, cows spend their lives being constantly impregnated in order to produce milk. Bulls can be difficult, so the majority of dairy cows are now artificially inseminated. Sex is a thing of the past. Antibiotics cure infections. Hormones have been designed to increase milk production. The cows are pushed hard for this production, and after roughly 3 or 4 years, their production slackens and are sold off as hamburger meat. This is the norm for mass production. This is the domination of nature. In the words of DJ Peach Cobbler, some random storyteller I know, some random YouTuber.
From the cattle's perspective, it's not a machine that creates meat and dairy products. From cattle's perspective, we're just torturing them for no reason.
What is it that imprisons someone? The physical walls, the prison guards, the surveillance technology, the judge, lawyers, and jury. None of these. And actually, the relevant question is this. Does the prisoner know what imprisons them? What is the nature of the power of the prison industrial complex? A cattle does not revolt. Every step of its life is manufactured and controlled by beings and machines far beyond its comprehension. It does not know what is real and was manufactured. It does not know that its very death has already been arranged before it was even born. For there is only one path available, the factory's conveyor belt, which only goes in one direction. Death in a factory has been made systematic as merely the operation of things. Day in and day out, the worker does the same repetitive task as to please an unmerciful God who shall smite him if he ever does stop. It is not a God he chose, but it is what he's stuck with. Only being able to consume whatever processed feed is given to it by the prison guard, however, is not evil. They simply want to sell their agricultural products to make a living. I don't imagine they want to think about their job too hard. In interviews conducted by the Human Rights Watch, slaughterhouse workers, reportedly majority immigrants, quote, broke into tears describing the stress, physical pain, and emotional strain they regularly suffered. Almost all explained that their lives, both in the plant and at home, have grown to revolve around managing chronic pain or sickness. Indeed, it is worse to think. The prisoner's life is presented as a segmented one. So here, courtyard there, cafeteria over here. The worker separates the place and or time of work from everyday life. He or she presents a socially, culturally, economically, politically segregated world. Segregated in order to uphold the myth, the magical and mystical nature of society. Disneyland is segregated from society to hide the fact that society is the real fantasy. 8. Prison segregated to hide the totalitarian nature of the world outside the prison. Everything has been encompassed in this myth. The myth of capital, the state, science, language, all of which are a form of power. Power is mythology. This is the nature of the Enlightenment. Quote, what men want to learn from nature is how to use it, in order to wholly dominate it and other men. That is the only aim.
Like shining one Sunday morning, I grew up without a warning.
The honor of my life to be your president. So many of you have written the past few weeks to say thanks, but I could say as much to you. Nancy and I are grateful for the opportunity you gave us to serve. One of the things about the presidency is that you're always somewhat apart. You spend a lot of time going by too fast in a car someone else is driving, and seeing the people through tinted glass.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
The parents holding up a child, and the wave you saw too late and couldn't return. And so many times I wanted to stop and reach out for me.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive.
Behind the glass and connect. Well, maybe I can do a little of that tonight. People ask how I feel about leaving. The fact is, parting is such sweet sorrow. The sweet part is California, the ranch, and freedom. The sorrow, the goodbyes, of course, and leaving this beautiful place. You know, down the hall and up the stairs from this office is the part of the White House where the president and his family live. There are a few favorite windows I have up there that I like to stand and look out of early in the morning. The view is over the grounds here to the Washington Monument, and then the Mall, and the Jefferson Memorial. But on mornings when the humidity is low, you can see past the Jefferson to the river, the Potomac, and the Virginia shore. Someone said that's the view Lincoln had when he saw the smoke rising from the Battle of Bull Run. Well, I see more prosaic things. The grass on the banks, the morning traffic as people make their way to work, now and then a sailboat on the river. I've been thinking a bit at that window. I've been reflecting on what the past 8 years have meant and mean. And the image that comes to mind like a refrain is a nautical one. A small story about a big ship and a refugee and a sailor. It was back in the early 80s, at the height of the boat people, and the sailor was hard at work on the carrier Midway, which was patrolling the South China Sea. The sailor, like most American servicemen, was young, smart, and fiercely observant. The crew spied on the horizon a leaky little boat, and crammed inside were refugees from Indochina, hoping to get to America. The Midway sent a small launch to bring them to the ship in safety. As the refugees made their way through the choppy seas, one spied the sailor on deck and stood up and called out to him. He yelled, "Hello, American sailor. Hello, freedom man." A small moment with a big meaning. A moment the sailor who wrote it in a letter couldn't
He
get
said,
out of
before the revolution, we never saw a doctor.
And the great bull buffalo had been named with the reverence of their word for father. The Sioux called him Totonka.
When my son went away, he left his gun with me. Now he is dead, the gun remains with me, rusting, uncleaned. When his sisters grow up, the gun will be ready for them to take their revenge. That is why I keep it uncleaned, as it is. His sisters ask me, why this gun? I answer, this is for you, to revenge the death of your brother, the death of all Arabs, to recover our land. We must liberate our land with the gun. You, generation after generation, must recover our land. The gun will always be with us. Always. Always.
"6 million genocided and some 60 more murdered. Unfathomable cruelties at Unit 731, the culmination of human progress since the feudal age. Science was completely made anew, it crossed realities and it discovered the world of quantum mechanics. It detonated in the sands of New Mexico, and it was named as if it was an act from God. Destruction and spectacle to show the Japanese, the Soviets, and the whole world what the potential of this new weapon was. Of course, the Allies were no stranger to bombing civilians. That was the purpose of bombs at the time after all. But come the nuclear age, and an even further sense of disconnection was felt. Mass murder was finally reduced to a single action. Is this not the great efficiency of science? With soldiers and civilians dying in the East and workers toiling in the West, Adorno and Horkhiemer asked, is this what human history has so gracefully led to? Quote, the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. How enlightened we have become. Dialectic of Enlightenment, originally published in 1944, was written in an environment, quote, in which scientific and pragmatic modes of thinking were dominant, and dialectics was seen as a sort of obscurantist thinking. In a time where most Americans thought of themselves as fighting the good war, Adorno and Horkhiemer applied Marxism to this new evolution in capitalism. The Gilded Age ended at the turn of the 20th century. Not 2 decades later, the world was engulfed in war. One of the reasons being militarism, spearheaded by profit-hungry arms dealers, which continues to this day in the form of the military-industrial complex. 12. Another reason being colonialism, also motivated by profit and power. This First World War would set the circumstances for the next. The Nazis did not come from nowhere. It was in a world of post-Age of Enlightenment, a world of colonialism and rampant capitalism which led to the Great Depression, thus also creating disillusionment in the people, facilitating support for the Nazis. 13. After the defeat of the Nazis, US capitalism entered the so-called Golden Age. Reaping the benefits, of course, were white male first worlders. Anything to subvert the status quo post-World War II would be seen as communist. Marxists like Adorno and Horkheimer recognized this new modernity of the post-World War II era as an evolution of capitalism. The significance of this analysis would soon be known 2 decades later during the unrest of the 60s through 70s, of which the Frankfurt School played a role. 14. This book is the foundation of modern thought. It is the Francis Bacon, John Locke of Enlightenment, the Kierkegaard of existentialism is the Hegel to Marx. But we should never fail to recognize what people like Adorno and Horkheimer do are insignificant compared to the masses who drive history. The only real significant philosopher is Marx and Engels. The most famous chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment is the culture industry. For the culture industry were simply numbers, tools, data, objects to be directed, used, etc., directed by this thing called human reason. Culture is enlightenment, and enlightenment is myth and religion. The book's famous thesis, myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology. To understand this thesis, however, we must begin at the concept of enlightenment. Before I begin, here are the editions of the book I will be quoting, and if I do not state the chapter in the citations, refer to the section of the video you're watching. If I do not state the page, I'm sorry, the copy I have does not have page numbers. My citations, as you have seen, will be in this format. This is not a summary of Adorno and Horkheimer's work, but I believe it can also serve that purpose. For this analysis, I will mainly focus on the US since it is the most totalitarian out of all liberal democracies. Don't blame me that the Europeans colonized the world. If the Africans did, I'd be talking about Africa. And with that, this is the concept of enlightenment, or actually before it. Many indigenous North American tribes, and this is a heavy generalization, viewed nature, which is reality, as a process that they were a part of. 15. This is what generally considered to be the spirituality that preceded enlightenment, which still exists today. As Foucault puts it, modernity is a body manipulated by authority rather than imbued with animal spirits. Of course, back then we used rituals and metaphysical beliefs to subjugate nature, even if only in the illusionary sense. Ancient Greek philosophy, quote, is the soul's search for salvation, which means for Plato deliverance from the suffering and evils of the natural world. It is a European Enlightenment that denounced such practices, colonizing the world and imposing new systems. Industrialization and politics and economics became a means to an end. Humans became scientists and businessmen, nature became resource, knowledge became specialized and simple. True power was then reached for the bourgeoisie, wherein discipline was inevitable and hyper-specialization was divine. Quote, the philosopher too seeks, like the scientist, to perfect the weapons of his knowledge through specialization. Like a Nazi concentration camp guard, humans are the cogs of a machine that carries out atrocities for no apparent reason amongst a sea of blank justifications. It was not a smooth transition, of course. We're skipping over decades of resistance. Liberalism and Enlightenment didn't take over the world just like that. Indeed, what has been established is monumental in its power, but its foundations were rough and chaotic. During the Gilded Age in America, as Steve Fraser notes in Chapter 5 of the Age of Acquiescence, there were mass strikes, which state police couldn't easily put down, and some local leaders even sided with the laborers, seeing the wealthy industrialists as alien to their community. I say this now, before the pessimism, to make you understand that these are human systems and they struggle against labor to keep themselves alive. The Bolshevik Revolution shook liberal foundations and inspired a whole wave of radicalism. The Cubans brought socialism to America's footstep, and America itself has socialist organizations. In the Third World, especially during the Cold War and decolonization, the fight for self-determination was as alive as ever, and still is. Capitalism is something that must necessarily be totalitarian to function, something that constantly reproduces itself because it requires infinite growth. Its sophisticated mechanisms evolved out of a desperation to keep itself alive, and in the process of this enlightenment, which is the enlightenment of the ruling class who innovates new forms of oppression, spirituality, that is any other form of being, is also killed. Previous beliefs of nature spirits become minerals, lumber, animal products, and energy. The wind and the rustle of leaves no longer carries with it a longing. Quote, Euro-Americans still search for the universal and absolute, something that can be understood, spoken, be assimilated into their own system of knowledge. Quipus of the Incas, a non-written system of recording information, and codices of the Mayans dissolve into historical artifacts. Oral traditions, too, relegated to corners of the world. to see without being seen. To instantly apply deadly force at a remove, to conjugate vision with annihilation. A century and a half later, this dream has essentially become reality, with only his fullest planetary reach yet to be attained." Unquote. In Bousquet's The Eye of War, he analyzes how knowledge functions in warfare. Perspective, surveillance, mathematical space, vision of the enemy means death. Precisely, the goal is to see without being seen. I believe this concept is better than Foucault's infamous panopticon. The battlefield is a chaotic place wherein order is constructed from technical violence and surveillance, from, quote, mathematicizing space, as Bousquet puts it. On the other hand, a prison is almost like a controlled lab environment, and thus quite lacking in the imagination of society. What I mean is that technology of sight should be viewed as a war zone. It is not a priori. 16. Jairus Groove writes in his article, A Martial Gaze Conscious of Itself, quote, "For Bousquet, not unlike Heidegger, the thinking, seeing, saying, and doing of modernity is a martial in reference to warfare. Thinking, seeing, saying, and doing. War is analogous to modernity. Sight is realizing war as death. This human mortality then serves politics. We must then ask, why have the intermediary of death? Sight itself is politics. Modernity as being is therefore the logistics of warfare. Observation is control, and so enlightenment enlightens the dark. Sees everything it wants to see and thus imposes its dictatorial power as surveillance of knowledge." Quote, "How one was to arrange botanical and zoological gardens and construct at the same time rational classifications of living beings. How one was to observe, supervise, regularize the circulation of commodities and money. How one was to inspect men, observe their presence and absence. Systematic classification of diseases. These were all twin operations in which two elements, distribution and analysis, supervision and intelligibility, are inextricably bound up. In the 18th century, the table chart was both a technique of power and a procedure of knowledge. It was a question of organizing the multiple, of providing oneself with an instrument to cover it and to master it. It was a question of imposing upon it an order. Kant said the model of enlightenment was, we dare to think. He arrogantly proclaimed, we shall rise out of our self-incurred immaturity. But what is this self-determination exactly? What is human reason but what society deems useful as a mere tool? It is the absolute control of experience. Domination of nature is reason. Absolute knowing is reason. To be reasonable is to dictate and subjugate everything. That is what is useful. Quote, the system for the Enlightenment has in mind is the form of knowledge which copes most proficiently with the facts and supports the individual most effectively in the mastery of nature. Its principles are the principles of self-preservation. Immaturity, then, is the inability to survive. Reason under Enlightenment never possessed the ability to liberate. It was always totalitarian. Enlightenment has always pursued its own self-preservation at the cost of nature and people. Never once has it reflected upon itself. 17. Alexander Villa made this video on gender, which is dictated by the truth of the institution, culture, and the like. In his video, he explained how a biologist discovered how fluid gender was even in terms of quote-unquote objective science. But knowledge has never been objective. Centuries of human history necessitated a binary, eventually creating the two ideas of gender and sex, the former being idea in your head and the latter being objective fact. This form of human reason becomes repressive, restricting the individual to arbitrary categories of male and female invented just like how race was, due to social necessity and economics based on historical context. The National Museum of African History and Culture mentions the modern ideas of colonialism. Quote, Enlightenment philosophy argued that there were natural laws that govern the world and human beings. Over the centuries, the false notion that white people were inherently became accepted worldwide. This categorization of people, such absolute and utilitarian ideas govern the world today. Because the horrors of colonialism has never once ceased, only evolved to be far more horrendous than the 18th century European mind could ever imagine. Enlightenment ideas continue to claim legitimacy today in the form of neoliberalism. Our universal acceptance of capitalism is Enlightenment domination. Here's how Adorno and Horkhiemer describes Kant's idea of enlightenment. Quote, to produce this unity of thought is the conscious task of science. If all empirical laws are only special determinations of pure laws of the understanding, research must always ensure that the principles are always properly linked with the factual arguments. This concurrence of nature with our cognitive facility is a priori assumption of judgment. Principles based on factual judgments, unity of thought, pure laws of understanding, and ultimately the assumption of being able to understand and get along with nature, that is enlightenment. Adorno and Horkhiemer quotes Bacon, 18. The sovereignty of man liveth hid in knowledge, which kings with their treasure cannot buy nor their force command. And yet, knowledge was and continues to be commanded, not by kings, but by the forces of capital which manifests itself in corporations and politicians, forces of culture manifesting itself in conservative rhetoric, science funded in order to be more efficient at exploiting, technology in order to be more efficient at surveillance. Instead of sovereignty, knowledge brought absolute control to every area of life through everyone's acceptance of it. The transcendental subject of knowledge, as the last remainder of subjectivity, is itself seemingly abolished and replaced by the operations of the automatic mechanisms of order, which therefore run all the more smoothly. Subjective knowledge and experience has been colonized by capitalism so that everyone is homogenized into a passive worker. This is how truth is formed today, whatever furthers the domination of contemporary social-economic structures. Pro-EU academic Thomas Ziegler writes, Sternhell also claims that, concurrent with the Enlightenment, another tradition was born, one comprised of a diverse collection of ideas that, in aggregate, served as a counterpoint to the Enlightenment. This tradition, still extant, wallows and relishes in tribalism, identity politics, the supremacy and excellence of a single chosen nation, intolerance towards and disdain for other nations, racism, and xenophobia. As it is unable to value the individual in a universal way, it is also unable to understand the relevance of universal human rights. Human rights, as universal truth, become our divine salvation from the barbarity of the fascists and monarchists. And in this recognition of rights, we adhere to yet another structure of power, one in which politicians funded by billionaires declare, we have the right to vote, but we don't have the right to housing. We have the right to free speech, but we don't have the right to healthcare. Western countries have the right to self-determination, while the third world has the right to be imperialized. Such scraps from billionaires are held sacred against the far right who attempt to subvert such rights. Liberals then retreat to protecting the state to defend their rights. The state is thus granted the right to rule from the divinity of human rights, as kings rule from the divinity of God. And yet, even the scraps the neoliberal state grants us are not guaranteed. One only needs to look at Palestine to see that we have no rights, not even the right to life. Our rights only exist when the state agrees they do. A traumatic truth is revealed in the process of fascism, that it fully cooperates with capital. The counter-enlightenment, so long as it is not Marxist, is true enlightenment. But Ziegler is not able to see this ugly side of capitalism. It is too traumatic. It is a Lacanian real. Human rights are the supposedly objective correct answer arrived at by independent reason. Quote, "From now on, matter will be at last master without any illusion of ruling or inherent powers, of hidden qualities. For the Enlightenment, whatever does not conform to the rule of computation and utility is suspect. In the process, it treats its own ideas of human rights exactly as it does the older universals. Human rights is utilitarianism, used when it benefits the state and capital, and vice versa. Atrocities are delegated to privatized war profiteers. Human rights is also a classic case of Marxist superstructure, an economic base of war profiteering, and a superstructure of human rights to justify it. Just like monarchy and organized religion, human rights, or absolute human reason, is a form of domination. It is God, the God created by man in the image of man, i.e. for man. Christianity once wanted to establish its authority on the soul, for the soul transcends mortal systems. Enlightenment brought the soul back now to earth. The soul is not transcendent, it's merely the mind, which is physical and analyzable. The transition between the two, transcendent soul and earthly soul, is not a transition at all, it's an evolution. In Foucault's Discipline and Punish, knowledge of the soul of the criminal is considered to establish intent. Knowledge of their mental state means a different form of treatment, or rather punishment. Prison, or the mental ward. So now the criminal repents to society instead of God, which is supposed to be more humane. RNA, risk and needs assessment, is a general term for algorithms which assess the risk of an individual reoffending. It's one of many instruments used to assess criminals. When used correctly, RNA supposedly helps people. Notably, RNA considers a person's circumstances and needs. This commentary article, What the Compass Core Risk Needs Assessment Is and Is Not, writes, needs that are non-criminogenic, such as housing, may also be included in agencies' configured set of need scales. These are included because it has been shown that treating these needs can support the treatment of criminogenic needs. Nature, or God, became societal. Just as with religion, such processes are naturalized. It is for their own good and society's good. Don't claim to be playing God is merely what is most efficient and effective. The CSG Justice Center reveals a lot more in their article. Quote, these assessments are similar to actuarial tools used by insurance companies to rate risk. They predict the likelihood of future outcomes according to their analysis. It is in a world where the only thing that matters is the result that these criminal justice algorithms arise. The purpose of RNA echoes that of insurance companies, whose bottom line is profit above all. Analyze and surveil, intervene and control, eliminate all forms of spontaneous risk, ensure not the people but our bottom line. Assess needs not because they're human beings which deserve support, but because they're criminals who might reoffend otherwise. Enlightenment reason is naturalized and becomes eternal as God. It is our salvation to subjugate nature. It is math that exists internally as the universal language is a creation of a human nature and a human right. It is transcendent and above society. Enlightenment defines reason as a mere instrument of measurement, a utility, and defines reason as things like science. Quote, on the road to modern science, Adorno and Horkhiemer write, men renounce any claim to meaning, a substitute formula for concept, rule and probability for cause and motive. There must be no particular that deviates from the universal. There must be no contradiction or difference, only homogeneity, only the growth of capitalism without hindrance. To Enlightenment, nature was merely a function, a system, and in this way science achieves objectivity. Science structures societal power, and also physical power in nuclear bombs, through a set formula of repetition. All causes derive from rules, and those rules are absolute. Quote, Myth turns into enlightenment and nature into mere objectivity. Men pay for their increasing power with alienation from that over which they exercise the power. Enlightenment behaves towards things as a dictator towards men. He knows them insofar as he can manipulate them. The man of science knows things insofar as he can make them. In this way, their potentiality is turned to his own ends. Domination precedes thought, and the control of nature is alienating. To give a concrete example of this, Ron Adams, in translation of Society of the Spectacle, writes, quote, "The previously common practice of hunting animals which will be cooked and then eaten is first replaced with packaged meat bought at the grocery store, has finally given way to the proliferation of packaged pre-cooked meals. Every step of the way we're more alienated from the production process and from nature," which was more famously described by Marx in his idea of commodity fetishism, later reification, where the commodity contains within itself a reinforcement of the social order. Our alienation from the production process obscures the functions of capitalism. Thus, these functions appear almost magical to the consumer. It is all contained within a single commodity. There's also more to say about how the production process makes products relate to money and commodity, not human labor, i.e. a relation among things and not among people, reification. Quote, "Its basis is that a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity, an autonomy that seems so strictly irrational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relation between people." But let's get back to Adorno and Horkhiemer. Nature is in this sense a commodity, and reason enlightenment the method of commodification. When enlightenment instrumentalized reason in this way, when reason became a means to an end, a means of control, Adorno and Horkheimer believed this was because of a fear of the unknown. Enlightenment seeks to conquer this fear through the inevitable march of progress. The world out there is to be analyzed, dissected, exploited for the benefit of man, reduced to such. Quote, "The multiplicity of forms is reduced to position and arrangement, history to fact, things to matter." God is objective in much the same way. Both God and reason seek to explain the world. They both see the world as something to be explained. In the book The Age of Acquiescence by Steve Fraser, he explains the mindset during the time of the Industrial Revolution. Quote, "Its champions conflated the metaphysics of freedom with the mechanics of material abundance. Freedom to the Enlightenment was control of the natural world, the explaining of it. And if explanation is control, repetition is absolute domination. Repetition is how Enlightenment incorporates subversion. Everything is expected as everything is explained. Every science experiment repeated, every instance of repeated human behavior dissected for the sake of making the most profit. It is in this sense that nature is a function, a system. The only reality that may exist is one of cogs and pistons. Every workday kept intact by the religious system of capital, every criminal faces the same defined punishment, every exact duplicate of the same factory worker and product row after row. That is the mundane power of repetition, so mundane that it's become invisible, natural. The homogeneity of capitalism cannot recognize humans. It recognizes only workers, managers, and bosses. Humans reduced to instruments and utilities, as is reality. Consumers and citizens, human resources and natural resources, everything is viewed through this filter. The homeless, disabled, the mentally ill, and so on are labeled as abnormal. Entire ecosystems are deemed to be in the way of progress. Protesters, revolutionaries, and artists, those are merely potential consumers and or opportunities to gain political points. Entire cultures and civilizations aren't people, they're just nuclear test subjects. Capitalism abstracts humans, calls them by literally any other name, not to disconnect the exploiters from what they're actually doing, but to be more efficient. It's more efficient to sell to categories of consumers. You can control categories of workers. Hitler can control the category of the Aryan race. The obvious law is this: being born into a society means you must exist on the terms of said society. A system is totalitarian in that it naturally pursues self-preservation. This self-preservation, in the case of capitalism and enlightenment, means elimination of individual thought and differences. Quote, adaptation to power progress furthers the progress of power. Those that benefit from society conform to it and obviously perpetuate it. Simply you cannot live outside of capitalism or the language of enlightenment. The reason both survives while the rational/poor die. The Enlightenment sought the freedom to do oppression on its own terms. Terms are supposedly more rational, resulting concepts like human rights, gender, science, and most of all, the dictator of everything, money and capital. To the liberals like Adam Smith, the free market would work perfectly in their fictional utopias. Reagan's trickle-down economics says that everyone gets a piece, but those who are more equal than others deserve their higher level of equality. This rationality of capitalism is the homogeneous system that we now see today, where diversity becomes mere political jargon and different consumer products. Oppressive reason is now absolute. Reason, the new form of monarchy, except now encourages dissent, as dissent only empowers and expands reason to incorporate more and more differences into a homogeneous blob. Today, everything must be justified, and everything is left to the experts. Truth, subversion, as mere cultural commodity, is indistinguishable from lies. Quote, and this in a world that verified only evidential propositions and preserved thought, degraded to the achievement of great thinkers as a kind of stock of old-fashioned cliches. Lies no longer can be distinguished from truth, neutralized as a cultural commodity. Quote, the culture industry's victory is twofold. What is destroyed as truth outside of its sphere can be reproduced indefinitely within it as lies. Reason in all its forms, from capital to categorization, has subjugated truth in its incorporation of nature as omnipotent. 19. Quote, this illusion, reason, in which a wholly enlightened mankind has lost itself, cannot be dissolved by a philosophy which, as the organ of domination, has to choose between command or obedience. If reason is absolute, and said reason is dictated by the society, then what do we get but eugenics, which made logical and scientific sense? Eugenics is just another way to control the unknown, the vast differences between humans as a result of nature. We sought to dominate and standardize the human race to have no flaws. The ultimate end goal of the Enlightenment, then, the ultimate standardization is, in one way, fascism and eugenics. The culmination of all human progress since the feudal age. Quote, the unity of manipulated collective consists in the negation of each individual. The horde which so assuredly appears in the organization of the Hitler Youth is not the return to barbarism, but the triumph of repressive equality. The disclosure through peers of the party of the right to injustice. Enlightened reason now becomes the nation-state and social Darwinism, colonialism, and vice versa. It's not a return to the medieval myths, but an evolution of modernity. True difference is not tolerated in the collective. All is dominated by reason and incorporated within it. The Nazi ideology is made up of the same people, the same rationality, the same devoted followers. The quote before mentions repressive equality. And what is more equal than the prices of products, which exist objectively and thus are placed on the level playing field of the free market. Quote, the material tool which is held on in different situations as the same thing, and hence divides the world as chaotic, many-sided, and disparate from the known one identical. The concept is the ideal tool fit to do service for everything wherever it can be applied. If we are to say this in the context of capital, then we have the all too obvious phrase, under capitalism, money is absolute. It is held on to in different situations as the same thing. Just as with human rights, the ever-shifting nature of reality is negated by capital is destroyed in hubris. To capitalism, there are absolutes which dominate reality, unifying it through mythology and which are also thus higher than reality. Enlightenment is totalitarian and capitalism is its contemporary form. It's not the quality of the price tag and the quality of a standardized commodity on the factory conveyor belt, also the quality of human workers. Dispensable as material objects, everyone is equally poor, as a capitalist would say. A factory worker equal to the next, a consumer equal to the next, just cycling through the landfill of the unemployed masses, a desensitizing process which occurs in every area of society from politics to social media. Every follower of Hitler is every alienated consumer of the latest movie or show. Homogenized through repetition, humans have already been automated long before today's AI revolution in both fascism and capitalism. But the totalitarian order, fascism, gives full rein to calculation and abides by science as such. Its canon is its own brutal efficiency.
Like shining morning, I grew up with.
For many people, an issue does not exist until it appears in the news media. How we view issues, indeed what we even define as an issue or event, what we see and hear and what we do not see and hear are greatly determined by those who control the communications world." Unquote. The feathered man, Odysseus, listens to a concert as immobilized as audiences later, and his enthusiastic call for liberation goes unheard as applause. In this way, the enjoyment of art and labor diverge. Unquote. Art is spectacle. Odysseus in the myth was trying to survive the sirens of the mermaids, so it plugs in the ears of his crew and directs the ship while tied so it doesn't go towards the sirens. Adorno and Horkhiemer compared this to bourgeoisie directing the blinded workers. Quote, "The rowers unable to speak to one another are all harnessed to the same rhythms like modern workers in factories, cinemas, and the collective." Unquote. Workers who live in a standardized routine modernity can only meet the sirens of liberation with applause, followed by petrification. The story is the story of capital surviving and thriving, the challenges nature or others, such as indigenous populations, present to it. Sacrifices made to the gods towards the end of human self-preservation. The natural law of this end and entrepreneurial success is justified, and the disenchantment of nature is seen as inevitable. The secret cunning and deception of Odysseus as the mechanisms of capital is simultaneously divine, absolute, and unsecret, such as ideology. And simultaneously again, it also seemingly preserves the individual as their own producer of reason, as a hard worker on their way to become millionaires and achieve the American dream. Indeed, the question is, what kind of individual does the disenchanted natural world produce and make absolute? Today, power is accepted in a homogeneous and universal way that is at the same time as concealed and secret as the medieval penal system and as heterogeneous as complete freedom. 32. The culture industry precisely makes itself the truth in this contradictory and therefore all-encompassing way. It is the all-too terrible reality that nothing new can arise. Mark Fisher describes this using Derrida's term of hauntology. Pixel indie games replaying older games, vaporwave analog, all confirm that the past is the only new thing left. It represents an age where there were new things. The past is repeated, reinvented, and made anew because nothing truly new happens in the modern age. Entering the building at 9, leaving at 5, sleeping at 12, waking at 8. The internet is one such example of what was once new. No doubt, sites like YouTube democratize speech, but it also invited giants like Google to control such sites. The internet began as a public, government-funded service for scientists and engineers in the 60s. Silicon Valley, with the backing of a new neoliberal government in the 90s, co-opted its internet and promised a sort of utopian future where everyone can voice their opinions and everyone was connected. But when has capitalism ever believed its own rhetoric? Ultimately, it was all for, you guessed it, profit, 33. Apple is obviously not here to connect the world and provide you with access to something amazing. They're here to sell you a goddamn product. They're here to convince you to throw away your device every couple of years to buy the latest model. Google isn't here to provide you with answers and information. They're here to mine your data, analyze your very behavior as a human being. They're here to monopolize the space and prevent any other better service from reaching you. In fact, they're currently facing antitrust lawsuit as of writing. The world that was promised from the 70s to the turn of the 21st century clearly did not come about. The new exciting internet is the largest force for alienation today. Nothing new or subversive can actually happen as long as capitalism stands. Truth is nullified by repetition. Art cannot by itself bring about change. It is repeated, expected. This video is merely a video and nothing more. Mark Fisher writes, no cultural object can retain its power when there are no longer new eyes to see it. To repeat a point in the video I made on American Psycho, the movie is etched into stone and turned into a joke or easy video essay. Its power never existed because ultimately its philosophy serves the status quo. There's a reason why it's pop culture. First as farce, then as nothing. The culture industry produces mundanity and turns it into commodity. It is within the dissected and analyzed consumer mind that mundanity, that cultural commodity, gains value. Experience, it is declared, is contained within pop media. Value is in the cultural commodity, not because it is based on human relations, not because it's a product of the people, of the community, but because it is in the system of capital, of a greater, abstract, even artistic process beyond your consumer understanding. A system of objects is already value. You need not humans to declare it so. You need not buy the products with your labor time. You need not use the product. It already exists autonomously outside of humans. The culture industry is Deleuze's society that controls Foucault's discipline and punishes Debord's society of spectacles, Marcuse's one-dimensional man's apprentice inventing reality, it's Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, it's Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation, it's even Lacan's real, it's Sheldon Woven's democracy incorporated, and it's the books or ideas themselves. The illusion of democracy is not kept up by lies such as division of power or bourgeois elections, but by capitalist realism, the realification of those lies, so that they are ingrained into society, fully exposed to every eye and therefore unacknowledged by every eye. The lack of true democracy is spectacularly placed upon the Foucauldian scaffold as politicians display themselves in whatever way necessary and the voter consumer audience watches from their homes and acknowledges the sovereignty of the two-party system, not the sovereignty of the people. Day by day, politician by politician, CEO scandal by CEO scandal, it is the repetitive declaration of destiny, of being. The fact that lobbying and super PACs exist is all the more reason to do nothing. It is unacknowledgeable, dogmatic, and appears on your screen every day to force its acknowledgement and thus its existence. Like the two-party system, life too is contained within two options, leisure and work. one supporting the other, mundanely created through this manufacturing of options in elections and in everyday living. The culture industry produces the reactions to a failing capitalism. Cynicism is one such manufactured reaction, wherein there is no such thing as society. 34. The Christian notion of salvation is thus revived, whereby systematic analysis is labeled as individual hatred of the world. Collapse of the capitalist system is synonymous with collapse of reality. Cynicism makes up American culture wars, where everything is about the way to salvation. It's all about the individual and nothing else. We must improve the individual in the cultural war to improve society. The cynical liberal, the cynical conservative. This hyper-individualism also takes on the form of doomerism, i.e. social pessimism. A whistleblower facing life imprisonment, update sentence is 6 years, is another drop in the bucket of the shit that is accepted daily. Our resistance is too small. Anything less than nationwide riots calling for Marxist revolution is seen as futile to the doomer. They separate themselves from the class struggle and individualize their life in an attempt to justify the status quo and pretending they oppose it, despite the fact that they are completely passive. They alienate themselves from the masses through a form of pessimistic individualism. Still further, the ideology even evolves into rebellion. Shallow liberals who fight minor injustices, conservatives who change society in order to go back to a romanticized past, rebellious to keep the status quo, i.e. a preemptive bourgeois counter-revolution appropriating socialist aesthetics to gain further control of the mind and body. In the EU, it keeps its imperialist apparatus intact and the immigrants out in another way, through welfare concessions to its populace. Even though the welfare is at the cost of third world slaves, then we apparently still have to be appreciative. Never mind rising anti-immigration sentiment in Europe, AfD in Germany, Vox in Spain, both Labour and Tories in Britain. Europe will contribute to eradicating populations in climate vulnerable countries, and when they face the consequences in the form of refugees, they close their borders and shut their ears. Europe is the international version of the lesser evil, and yet the lesser evil still funds genocide. Lastly, there is also the simple explanation, as evidenced by American romanticization of Europe, the success of Bernie Sanders who represented populist left-wing economics, people's anger at US healthcare system. Recently, CEO of United Healthcare was shot, and there were some comments on a CNN video. United Healthcare's community post also has 70,000 laughing emojis. Hundreds of thousands of voters uncommitted due to Palestine. More historically, obviously, Iraq and 2008, and even how universally concerned people are about climate change. From all of this, it is very clear that people want an alternative. Someone just has told them that exists. People want housing, they want healthcare, a decent standard of fucking living, a future not ravaged by climate change. They don't want children in the third world to be making their products. They don't want to spend trillions on getting Iraq's oil. No average person supports billionaires. People want public transportation. Well, that's debatable, but you get my point. Fucking organize.
Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world.
Thus, marketing becomes the pivot on which our continued prosperity turns.
Ever hear of Karl Marx? In his mind, communism was born more than 100 years ago. He looked at the world and saw the man.
As I said before, people become groups of interest to sell to. Products are standardized to fit the interests of as many people as possible. This simultaneously standardizes interests. People buy the same products. Consumer dependency is one such method of standardization. In Tom Nicholas's video, he analyzes how corporations get us to spend our money. Addictive substances, nicotine, sugar, caffeine, removes the risk of consumers choosing not to buy. Dopamine is typically exploited by online companies to keep us watching ads and buying subscriptions. Apple doesn't allow you to repair your own phone, so you depend on them for repairs. Some products need fuel to keep working, so if you want to keep using said product, product, you need to keep buying fuel from the same corporation. Tom Nicholas uses the example of razor blades. Corporations sell the handle, then make you keep buying their specific brand of blades. Printers make you keep buying their brand of ink. Game consoles make you only buy games that are compatible with said console. Many services make you get used to them so it's difficult to switch. For example, Adobe offers a free trial when to learn the interface is difficult to switch. Giant corporations also have more resources, so small businesses can never really get a foothold, not to mention buying out competition. Products of necessity are especially lucrative. Insulin for diabetics is restricted by patents, and so companies can charge whatever price they want. Healthcare is a necessity, so it is exploited for profit. Privatization transforms public services into commodities. Water is bottled and sold. In Mexico, there's more Coca-Cola than water. Coca-Cola replaced fucking water because both are commodities. They're competing. Coca-Cola's lobbying power in Mexico is unmatched, and as a result, thousands die from diabetes. But it's not only the accessibility that's the problem here. Advertisements have ingrained Coca-Cola into Mexico's very culture. Coca-Cola is literally producing culture. McDonald's indoctrinates children into loving their product, which builds brand loyalty. From nostalgia to status symbols, corporations will go to any lengths necessary to keep you within the system that upholds them as the winner and you as a loser. It's all about removing consumer choice, human autonomy. They want the same addicts to their products, the same dependency to capital. It's all about the efficiency of systems. There's no evil billionaire or CEO, just a machine dissecting the world for its own self-preservation. They don't create the illusion of consumer choice because they're evil. They put so many products on the shelf because that's just what works. There's no right and wrong, no planning for the future, no consideration for a majority of human beings, because that's just how things operate. That's just the natural law of profit. How absurd is it that companies commodify water and landlords profit by just owning housing and land? Quote, the spectacle gradually leads individuals to identify personal satisfaction with survival itself. This transforms satisfaction into a commodity, and transversely, survival itself becomes a commodity, unquote. Capitalism says that it's a luxury you have food, that you have been given the right to life by capital, and even if you play their game, buy their products, it's still not enough. They force you to spend even more in order to use said product. In today's age, you own nothing, not your means of survival, not the products you purchase. Subscription to streaming services and audiobooks grow ever more. Services which merely lend you their products and thus could be taken away at any time. At least legislation is being passed to give people the right to repair, but the corrupt US government will never address the root of the problem, profit. Quote, something is provided for everyone so that no one can escape. Differences are hammered home and propagated. Difference does not exist under capitalism. All is universally beholden to what makes the most profit. Quote, it is not that exchange value no longer dominates, but that use value is now deployed in an ideological way that exploits the needs of the new consumer self. Even the consumer that wants to escape consumerism, trying to prioritize use value, is still within consumerism. Think about how difficult it is to find a high quality product these days, how difficult it is to filter out all the false advertising and planned obsolescence. The Soviet Union, in contrast, made products for its use value. Rarely did Soviet-made goods break down. In East Germany, the company Superfest made unbreakable glass, but obviously a durable, long-lasting product is bad for business. And so, like how the Phoebus cartel prohibited long-lasting light bulbs, it was taken off the shelf once the Berlin Wall fell. Capitalist consumption is the model for how capitalism treats everything else it infects. Its structures that attempt to consolidate power in every sector of life are intimately interwoven with each other, lobbying politicians, creating culture, selling products, advancing science, all towards the same end of domination. As the saying goes, we have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. To quote Noam Chomsky, if everyone had to vote freely, Madison said, the majority of the poor would get together and they will organize to take away the property of the rich. That, he added, would be obviously unjust, so the constitutional system had to be set up to prevent a democracy. Quote, technical rationality today is the rationality of domination. It is the compulsive character of a society alienated from itself. Technical rationality is the technical reasoning of free market apologia. Technical rationality is technology which advances in accordance with capitalism, that is, technology is by and for the rich. Reason from free market economics to technological innovation is purely towards the end of domination. Technical rationality is the technical mechanisms of capital. The rigid mechanisms of capitalism are fluid insomuch as the worker is in constant instability. The constant threat of unemployment, economic crashes every other year, debt crises, wage cuts, decreasing job benefits, rising housing prices, and so on. The fluidity is the American dream. Chaos turned towards capital's own ends. As much as the stock market fluctuates, the poor will never have the resources and knowledge of the already rich. Why the rich are not affected by capitalism's fluidity is thus seemingly secret. They possess a hidden ability to have self-determination. Yet, the fact is, the mechanisms of capital already declare them exempt from the precariousness of the poor. The common people suffer the fuck-ups of banks in 2008. Corporations buy up houses just to get a little richer while hundreds of thousands go homeless. BlackRock owns significant shares in giants such as Apple and Amazon, and it manages trillions of dollars. Private equity buys companies and then butchers them for profit. The New York Times writes, quote, companies bought by private equity are far more likely to go bankrupt than companies that aren't, 10 times as likely. Over the last decade, private equity firms were responsible for nearly 600,000 job losses in the retail sector alone. Unquote. On top of this, private equity firms enjoy tax cuts, as is the American way. Leveraged buyouts are when private equity firms buy a company at a loan, but the company being bought, not the firm buying, assumes the debt, kind of like mafia. The company goes to extensive lengths to pay off said debt, cutting corners, mass layoffs, etc. Eventually, this could contribute to bankruptcy, and if people losing their jobs wasn't bad enough, in America, healthcare is privatized, and, well, a patient at Manor Care died due to negligence. Quote, as private equity firm Carely claimed, it did not technically own Manor Care, rather Carely merely advised a series of investment funds with obscure names that did. Private equity is not responsible for the damages they cause. If you want to learn more about this, see these videos by Wendover, A More Perfect Union, and Good Work. People getting wage and benefit cuts or losing jobs entirely, companies going bankrupt and potentially creating food deserts which gut the community and open them up to predatory retail chains instead of local businesses. These are the mechanisms of capitalism. In the same vein, politics too becomes TV static, constantly changing but the same black and white noise. Time goes on and we see the static pretend to go on with it, with each noise different than the last, but ultimately it's all still static. Liberal governments will promote free speech, self-determination for countries, justice, and equality, what have you, but as soon as a country elects a socialist leader or develops anti-American policies or becomes strategically useful, suddenly that country needs to be liberated. If a political activist provides an alternative to capitalism or disagrees with the state, if a whistleblower reveals some sensitive information, suddenly they find themselves dead or in prison. Suddenly, pro-Palestine protesters get suppressed by police and outlawed by introduction of a new anti-Semitism bill not yet passed as of writing. Just as with civil rights and Vietnam, it's the same spectacle. There's no candidate outside of the two parties, and the power of the rich, from the Gilded Age then to lobbying now, does not change. Freedom and spontaneity exist only within capital. Choosing socialism is not conceptually possible. This next section will not be edited because it will be turned into its own video. You don't care. Anyway, socialism. Ooh. So I'm recording this outside. The audio is gonna be pretty shitty. There's background noise inside. when I make this into its own video, I'll re-record everything. Okay, audio is going to be better, whatever. In order to spread self-determination, the US attempted to dictate the future of Vietnam for its own political gain. Terrorism was stopped through destabilizing an entire region and plummeting a country into anarchy. Russia and its neighbors were liberated by their complete economic collapse. Just like fear-mongering about China today, the West hated the Soviet Union because it didn't want to submit to US hegemony, because it was another way of life, because it determined for itself where it wanted to go, because it funded decolonization movements in the third world. In reality, the USSR was a normal country with faults and successes. Really, if there is an evil country, it's the US and its European allies who for centuries waged war on the brown and yellow people for their own political economic gain, which continues to this day. Russia was not in need of being civilized. Iraq wasn't, Vietnam wasn't, all of Latin America wasn't, and China isn't. As the famous line among leftist circle goes, quote, the brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could, unquote. Black Shirts and Reds, Prenti, p. 65. Prenti referred to many examples of how people took advantage of the inefficiencies of the system. Under capitalism, in contrast, taking too long of a bathroom break would get you fired. Yurchak, a liberal who apparently claims to be humanizing the USSR, writes, quote, required Kosovo meetings were often reported without actually being held. The K-word, the meetings convener, will often suggest maybe we should just write down that we had a discussion and voted in favor of the resolution, without actually having the discussion. I understand that everyone has things to attend to at home, unquote. Yurchak, p. 16. People in the totalitarian state regularly slacked off. The state and ideology, according to the Western conception, was all-powerful. Yurchak writes, quote, what tends to get lost in the binary accounts is a crucial and seemingly paradoxical fact that for great numbers of Soviet citizens, many of the fundamental values, ideals, and realities of socialist life, such as equality, community, selflessness, were of genuine importance. Despite the fact that many of the everyday practices routinely transgressed, reinterpreted, or refused certain norms and rules represented in the official ideology of the socialist state, Yurchak, p. 8. People were not under the thumb of ideology like how conservatives in America actually are. The so-called communist dictatorship of the early days of the USSR, where no one was allowed to think any opposing thoughts, was described by anti-communist historian J.R. Getty like this, quote, the struggles over economic planning, treatment of opposition, and the balance of power within the territorial party apparatuses were separate problems in the early 1930s. Political leaders argued over the rate of economic growth, the status of the opposition, and how to reform the regional party networks. Additionally, there was an ongoing tug-of-war between the center and the provinces over patronage and fulfillment of decisions. The Communist Party, far from having penetrated every corner of Russian life, was more an undisciplined and disorganized force, unquote. Getty, pp. 25-27. The early Central Committee couldn't even keep track of who was actually in the party. Sometimes petty criminals would join. Getty, pp. 31-35. And the purges of that time period were a result of it being so disorganized and focused on surviving the Civil War. By the end of the war, the party had corrupt officials, people who didn't actually do anything, whites who sneaked their way in, and petty bourgeois individuals. I know it seems harsh to punish wealthy peasants, but people were literally starving. It's pretty hard to follow ideals in a war-torn country. This organizing and cleaning up of the party was chaotic and separate. It was not intentionally or specifically used to suppress dissent. Only a small percentage of the purges was actual power consolidation. Getty, pp. 38-47. Clearly, control under the Soviet state comes nowhere near control under liberal democracies. 35. The USSR was founded from the decaying corpse of a feudalist aristocracy. It survived 2 world wars, a civil war spearheaded by capitalist imperialists, and a Cold War where had to spend tons on the military instead of on welfare and economic development. 46. In contrast, the US began with millions of slaves. It gained resources and land through genociding Native Americans, and it was the most well-off after World War II. And yet, Americans still compare a country that was founded less than 30 years ago at the time of the Cold War, which also survived the most horrific war in modern history, to a country an ocean away from the carnage in Europe who industrialized fucking decades before the USSR. It's an absolute miracle that the USSR reached the heights that it did, propelling humanity into the space age in 35 years. A majority of which was filled with war. All of this historical context is conveniently left out to perpetuate the Cold War-style anti-communist propaganda, and such propaganda continues to be far more effective and totalitarian than anything done by the Soviets. Quote, the idea that censorship is a contingent, external accident to speech emerged not from disinterested speculation, but from a centuries-long battle waged by intellectuals beginning in the Enlightenment to remove themselves from the tutelage of authority. Unquote. P29 Matthew Bunn. When liberals critique censorship under socialism, what is actually being done is the production of capitalist culture. Their critique says that 1. Capitalism has no censorship. 2. Censorship is always bad when it's under communism or socialism. And 3, which relates to 1, censorship can only come from authority. These are some of the main assumptions among various other liberal assumptions. Though no doubt Soviet censorship was wholly unjustified in many cases, this does not mean that communism has the explicit aim to control information. If the evil commies really wanted to pacify its populace, it would have tried to keep a majority of people stupid. Quote, however, the demand for education could not be satisfied because the Tsarist government deliberately restrained cultural development. In the beginning of the 20th century, about 22% of Russians were literate. By 1939, the USSR literacy rate had reached 81.2%. Unquote. Full literacy would be achieved after some more years. In contrast, as of 2024, only 79% of Americans are literate. Nat Literacy Institute, more powerful than any state censorship is poverty. Liberals do not actually care about freedom of speech or any other so-called human right. Such rights only apply when it benefits their system of power. Quote, these forms of censorship involve private actors whose interactions within civil society are conceived as purely voluntary and thus free of illegitimate cohesion. Bunn, p. 32. The free market is divine truth. Censorship is precisely perceived as whatever diverts from that truth, whatever is immoral outside of the liberal ideology. Bunn, pp. 45-46. Suppressing communism is just common sense. It's only censorship when it's communist. A Lithuanian describes his experience in the Soviet Republic. Quote, that name is grateful for the opportunity to experience life in 2 different political systems. We felt economically but not politically safe during the socialist system. You hear that car, dude? Okay, maybe it wasn't a good idea recording this outside. Although we waited in lines for basic food or household items, we were not afraid of losing our jobs. Now we have to compete and prove our value. Still, he adds, while no system is perfect, having freedom is better. Precisely if the West has colorful consumerism, then they are more free. If they have a choice between a genocide supporter, Biden-Harris, and a fascist, Trump, then they are more free. If they can choose between this blue thing made from child labor or this green thing made from child labor, then they are more free. A Soviet citizen would criticize their own society while a Westerner would usually praise theirs, but the totalitarian one is apparently the former. The premise for this belief is that, quote, the collapse of Soviet socialism was predicated on this badness and immorality of the system. your check P5. And the US need not send police to your door and need not censor as much as the USSR because you are already stupefied and pacified. What's indoctrinated into the Western mind is the Berlin Wall, evidently showing Eastern totalitarianism because America has never reinforced its borders before, nor had it ever had concentration camps for immigrants. The Berlin Wall is the ideal propaganda material. What is constructed is not a wall of pragmatic use, but an abstract capitalist reality. The wall does not reinforce borders, it reinforces capital. Let us take a new perspective on the wall beyond Western propaganda. 1. This was during the Cold War, harsh measures had to be taken. A reinforced border also prevents spies. 2. The West was far more developed and less damaged by World War II. Obviously, it'd be more attractive and people want to immigrate. It's like when people compare Cuba, a small island nation, to the US, a global superpower. And 3, it wasn't as if the East was a desolate wasteland. Socialist countries provided a lot of welfare, and for its citizens to just up and leave after being provided housing, education, healthcare, etc. is a massive economic loss, especially for a recovering republic of the Soviet bloc. Now on the East-West German division, and whose quote-unquote fault it was, there's debate about the so-called Stalin Note, which proposed negotiations for a unified, neutral Germany. The Wikipedia article on this is actually not that bad. Go and read it. The West did not consider unifying Germany because they wanted more influence and control. In my opinion, a neutral Germany would have been better for the East, considering how the West has most of the power. This article, Stalin and German Reunification 1994, which is on the side of the West. First of all, it explains how the note was not really by Stalin, mind you. Says that the note was not genuine negotiation and it was rather directed at the German people, specifically the left. I argue the West should have been more open to negotiations, and even if the note wasn't genuine, good, fucking good. I mean, the Soviets were completely right to antagonize the West. It was good that the Eastern government tried to inspire the people for a unified Germany. The issue of German divide is also an example of how Westerners automatically view the East as the sole aggressors. It's all the fault of the communists, and the West had absolutely no play in the matter. The evil commies are always scheming because of their totalitarian nature. Certainly, the USSR and its republics weren't perfect. See Hakim's fault of former socialism, but it wasn't cartoonishly evil. An American tourist in East Berlin describes it as so. Quote, I remember buying an alleged cola at lunch that was pale amber colored. Tasted like water and costed about 10 cents. Perfect metaphor for life in the East as far as I know. Cheap, but still not worth it. I do recall that the pastries were actually tasty though, unquote. Life was simply dull. The most oppression these tourists found in the East was a train official assuming they were spies just because they were from the West. He quickly realized how stupid the idea was. Quote, though Yugoslavs could not really become rich, through hard work it was possible to attain modest wealth to buy a snazzy car, a vacation home, Western imports, and other niceties, unquote. Similarly, near the end of USSR and its republics, people were disillusioned. They wanted more consumer products, not heavy industry. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact functions similarly to the Berlin Wall. The pact is not a result of politics, but a representation of evil, of Eastern decadence. Reality does not exist, things don't happen, instead there are simulations and farce. Media and culture war. Quote, image now seems to be the whole point of political discussion. It is not the issues we are asked to judge. It is the nuances of the presentation, unquote. Inventing reality, P14. Anything to further capital and make everything else mere illusion. Somehow, within the deluded fantasies of Western minds, capitalist cooperation with fascism that continues to this day is far less significant than a single pact in World War II. Quote, the French government had been particularly eager to avoid fighting Hitler and proposed engaging Stalin instead, unquote. Archives, That Time Britain and France Almost Bombed the Soviet Union, 2015. Patrick Osborne. The West loved Hitler until he turned his violence on them instead of leftists. Quote, the USSR, and especially its Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Maxim, that name, offered collective security or an anti-Nazi alliance to France and Great Britain. Paradoxically, Stalin's blood-drenched wickedness did not mean that Soviet foreign policy was wicked also. But in France and Great Britain, the determination to resist fascism was sapped by hatred of Bolshevism, fear of socialist revolution, and sneaking admiration for Hitler's repression of the left, unquote. End of the low, dishonest decade, failure of the Anglo-Franco-Soviet alliance in 1939. Even with all the fervorous anti-communist language, the facts are laid bare. France and Britain rejected an anti-Nazi alliance because they hated socialism. The West hated it so much, in fact, they supported Pol Pot and fascist Latin American regimes for the sake of profit. They enslaved entire countries and exploited their resources using the Third World for cheap labor. The U.S. placing military bases in every corner of the globe, contributing to the Libyan civil war, funding Israel, vetoing any pro-Palestine resolution in the UN, funding or being passive to Hitler's rise, as well as other fascists like Franco, 37, etc., etc. Tell me again, who's the fascist? The Soviet Union or the West? Winston Churchill, who has wet dreams about putting all the brown people in chains, would rather side with the fascists than let the commies take over in Greece near the end of World War II. Quote, 28 civilians, mostly young boys and girls, were killed and hundreds injured. We had all thought it would be a demonstration like any other. That name recalls. Winston Churchill considered the influence of the Communist Party within the resistance movement he had backed throughout the war, the National Liberation Front, EAM, to have grown stronger than he had calculated, sufficient to jeopardize the plan to return the Greek king to power and keep communism at bay. So he switched alliances back to the supporters of Hitler, unquote. Athens, 1944, Britain's dirty secret. It is unclear if the British themselves shot at the demonstrators, but Churchill's position is as naked as a colonialist maniac can be. Quote, ultimately, the telegram ended with the stern message, we have to hold and dominate Athens. It would be a great thing for you to succeed in this without bloodshed, if possible, but also with bloodshed, if necessary, unquote. Even the American press was against the British fuck. Quote, additionally, the portrayal of the communists as sympathetic freedom fighters in the press handicapped Great Britain's ability to call upon the United States for aid, unquote. Greece's unappreciated place in British political history. More damningly than British colonialism being British colonialism is the fact that American corporations did business with the Nazis, and after they were gone, corporations then proceeded to do business in apartheid South Africa. The consciousness of the corporation, Harry Murphy, undated. Who cares how many people die, how many Palestinians are run over by bulldozers, as long as the money keeps fucking flowing? And none of this is to even mention the infamous Operation Paperclip or any of these names. Capitalism was and still is deeply in love with fascism. The evil Stalinist regime could have never imagined committing atrocities to the extent of the Western world. It did not intentionally cause famines, see bad and banana, like the British during the Bengal famine, has never colonized half the globe for centuries. This article tries to equate U.S. neocolonialism to Soviet passivity during Khrushchev on the question of French colonies in North Africa. Quote, similarly to the United States, the Soviet Union sought to reconcile two contradictory objectives by appeasing the colonial powers and comforting the nationalist movement seeking to overthrow it. p. 66. Quote, in order to achieve this goal of hegemony, they both favored France's presence to that of their perceived enemy, unquote. The United States, the Soviet Union, and decolonization of the Maghreb, 1945 to 62. Because the USSR wanted good relations with France, that's apparently the same as the US sending guns and bombs to the French to kill Algerian civilians. The article, however, also admits, quote, the Soviet Union succeeded in gaining the friendship of the Algerian nationalists in spite of its détente with France. The Soviet success was due to the material, moral, and diplomatic support it provided the nationalists. Ibid. p. 81. Sure, I would have preferred that the Soviets acted like the Chinese, viciously advocating for armed anti-colonial struggle. However, it had to consider European politics. Deteriorating French-American relations and improving French-Soviet relations was their priority. But if the French public turned in favor of decolonization, the Soviets would have gladly supported that. An independent Algeria would have been great for the Soviets. Because the West colonized the world, they hold all the power. Any power not held by them is good for the Soviets. The Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, even said this at the UN, quote, as the atrocities of the Hitlerians cannot make France either German or semi-German, neither could all the crimes and actions aimed at crushing the Algerian people's struggle for national liberation make Algeria French or semi-French, unquote. Ibid. p. 80. The USSR was not the one that colonized the world. They're just in a world that's colonized, and they didn't do neocolonialism where, sure, regions get independence, but their economics, resources, and politics still belong to the West. Not once did the USSR have a war as bad as Vietnam. It has never openly committed genocide like the West over and over and over again. If you think poverty and famine amounts to genocide, then the West still outranks the Soviets by millions or billions as we see corporations and the government continue to exploit brown people. The USSR actually did a lot of great things. Before I mention stuff about welfare and space technology, let me expand on that. Edward Podolsky writes in Some Achievements of Soviet Medical Research, quote, the state encourages the search for new medical facts and techniques, and men who achieve results are honored as national heroes, unquote. pp. 77 to 83. Podolsky. Reconstructive surgery repairs the functions and appearances of parts of the body, healthy skin transported from other parts of the body to repair damages, a new throat transported from dead body to a woman over the course of months, a new technique to straighten out the spine, innovations in blood transfusions, easier and less painful childbirths. Those are just some medical innovations. Housing was a priority in the country. Quote, the Soviet Union tackled at breakneck speed a severe housing problem inherited from Tsarism, a problem compounded by the devastation of the War of Intervention and later by World War II, unquote. Housing in the USSR, while corporations buy up houses as an investment as hundreds of thousands are left homeless, the sole priority of the Soviet Union was to house its people. Because it wasn't concerned with profit. Housing the people benefits everyone. It just made basic fucking sense that the state should try and solve crises. But under capitalism, corporations profit off crises. Healthcare, housing, shortages of any kind, the well-being of the nation as a whole be damned, as long as the CEO gets a higher paycheck. Quote, now, almost 30 years later, the majority of urban families live in modern apartments of their own, a significant improvement, unquote. Morton, 1984. Feudal Russia had little to no urban centers. Most people suffered from disease. Sewage systems were only present in just 5% of cities by the 1900s. Water supply, Wikipedia, 38. After World War II, at the very minimum, the homeless and buildings destroyed numbered in the millions. This was the situation the USSR faced while constructing, because statistics aren't available, estimated millions of apartments. Liberals love to complain about the greatness of those apartments and how rushed the construction was, and thus how low the quality was, but this article still admits that, quote, communist countries succeeded in providing nearly free housing for all workers. Rents were set at 5% of income. In the UK today, we spend 26% of our income on rent. Citizens were provided with brand new dwellings with central heating and hot water and electricity, which was unusual for the USSR at the time, unquote. City Monitor. Unusual. Let me state this again. 4 to 5 decades ago, they lived in actual feudalism. 3 decades ago, they faced a brutal civil war. 1 decade ago, Hitler was reducing their homes to rubble. So yeah, it was fucking unusual that they suddenly got modern apartment buildings. Women's rights in the USSR is a popular topic. Quote, in order to assure women's active participation in production, the additional costs such measures necessitate pregnancy protections, paid leave to take care of sick children, etc., are borne by the full society, unquote. Development Strategies and the Status of Women, 1986, p. 76. Quote, the fact that women began to gain parity in engineering during the 1970s is especially important because a degree in engineering is almost a prerequisite for achievement to positions of responsibility in Soviet industry, unquote. Ibid, p. 78. Has the U.S. heavily advanced women's rights? No, women had to actively fight for their rights. Has the U.S. provided citizens with healthcare, housing, and basic standard of living? No, hundreds of thousands are still homeless, 47 million food insecure, including 14 million children. Has the U.S. contributed to decolonization? No, it has claimed to be freeing the Philippines from Spain but occupied it. 39. It continues to fund the last vestiges of settler colonialism in the Middle East. It uses IMF loans to continue exploiting the third world. Whatever bad thing you think the USSR did, the crucial fact is that it was in the context of the Cold War or any other struggle for its survival. The U.S., on the other hand, continues to commit atrocities, continues to abuse its citizens during peacetime in the 21st century. However, I'm not here to cherry pick. I'm sure the U.S. had some episodes where it wasn't genocidal, like no, not during the founding, not the Civil War. Blacks were still pressed of Civil War. Gilded Age was horrible for workers. Progressive era, a bunch of liberal bullshit and liberal concessions. It was the workers that doing all the work during the Gilded Age. In World War I and World War II, corporations actively funded the enemy, and allies also committed tons of atrocities. So what if I'm openly biased? Who cares that some white male Americans got a good standard of living? Ask the black people during any period of American prosperity if they feel prosperous, or the Native Americans, or the Hispanics, or me, I'm an immigrant. Sure, slavery is gone, sure, queer people are more accepted, but that is despite the government and capitalism. Would you mention good things about a country that committed genocide and proceeded to support more genocide? Evidently not. Liberals would never mention anything good about the USSR. Let us now talk about some flaws of the Soviet Union. The worst of Soviet crimes was the banning of religion. This ban only gave more ammunition to the capitalists. Marx recognized religion was used to promote conservatism, but it can just as well be used to promote progressive ideas. Prenti also has some critiques in Black Church and Reds. There's lots of faults I mentioned before, like arbitrary censorship, overemphasis on heavy industry, the disorganized and chaotic early days of the Soviet Union, and obviously Stalin did some terrible things I need not mention. However, he was not Hitler 2.0, nor did he have absolute control. That's a cartoonish caricature of how the USSR functioned. Analyze Stalin, 40, as a leader of a country, not a divine supernatural force from the deepest realms of hell. Anyway, Afghanistan, 41 Eastern Bloc interventions, they are not comparable to Western imperialism. The CIA did far, far worse with far less reason. Black market, this is also not comparable to billionaires and American politicians. Bureaucrats skimming a bit off the top are not billionaires owning an entire political economic system. And this is more niche and obscure, but Stalin, what the fuck, man? Why did you support a Chinese nationalist? Communism is spreading too fast and it's gonna anger the US and make them intervene in China. Damn right it's gonna anger the US. 42. According to Morton in Housing the Soviet Union, though he ideologically compares the USSR to the US, as was the norm, he implies some unrealistic expectation of the USSR. He assesses that rural populations and people on the outskirts didn't have housing as good as urban populations. Migration from rural to urban areas was limited to the lack of housing, but obviously there was a black market for this, causing as well a lack of laborers in the urban centers. Housing was also not prioritized during Stalin after World War II, when the country was in desperate need of rebuilding. Soviet women's rights were obviously not perfect. Quote, "The problem lies in a lack of any corresponding change in the social perception of men's roles." Unquote. P85. Perhaps the worst failure of the USSR is its inability to defend itself against capitalism. Cuba, though embargoed and weak, is at least still alive. Socialism must be able to preserve itself, with the state and soldiers, with unions and cooperatives, with community and mass support, with socialist propaganda and socialist artists and intellectuals, with good leadership and organization, what have you. The USSR survived the Civil War, but couldn't survive Gorbachev and the new generational sentiment. That's fucking tragic. So, was the USSR utopia? Of course not. In the early days, it was absolutely horrible to live in. During its middle and end, life was rigid, boring, and bureaucratic. The justified criticisms of the former Soviet Union, however, did not justify bringing neoliberalism to the Republic. Today, the result of that romanticization of liberalism is oligarchy and economic collapse. Is Putin really better than the bureaucracy of the former republic, or will liberals claim that somehow shock therapy, quote-unquote, went wrong? Some far-right bigots even resort to saying that Russia is, and I'm not joking, still somehow secretly communist to desperately try and keep their pro-capitalist worldview intact. The USSR served as a counterbalance to Western hegemony. If it was still alive here today, the Israeli genocide would either be not as bad or practically non-existent. Iraq would be as well. But the West has absolutely no opposition, so it can get away with atrocity after atrocity. Like colonial times, it once again has a monopoly on power. Quote, Churchill will later realize the EAM's more sinister goal of transforming Greece into a communist state with a totalitarian liquidation of all political opponents. Unquote. P84. Anytime a socialist organization gains power, they're labeled as dictatorships. Stalin had a cult of personality while George Washington was objectively great. Propaganda films like The Men Who Built America gladly glorify Gilded Age monopolists, but if a socialist had power anywhere close to the level of the bourgeoisie, it would be seen as worse than Hitler. The monopolists are glorified in the film as driving the economy forward, but Stalin's industrialization was ruthless. If the human race has any integrity at all, in time, capitalism and colonialism will be viewed as bad as we view monarchies today. It birthed some of the worst and most brutal empires in history. It was a period of rampant barbarism that went alongside progress, just as medieval times. Kings displayed the scaffold of torture, but there were agricultural innovations. The US imprisoned and surveilled millions, but there were scientific innovations. The US will be viewed as people view the USSR today. as a violent, unaccountable, totalitarian regime that systematically oppressed and killed millions or resulted in the killing of or oppression of millions in Vietnam, Iraq, Palestine, Latin and Central America, Cambodia, Laos, Libya, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Iran, South Africa, Syria, Haiti, Cuba, Russia, Eastern Europe, North America itself, and that's not even the whole list. I remember Prenti describing it as a worldwide Holocaust. Despite its crimes, the US is still the greatest country in the world, just as great as Rome during its empire period. The conservative and the fascist share this in common, the control and romanticization of the past. As Big Joe analyzed in his video, the conservatives ascribe their beliefs to a universal utopian order, a common sense, a normal and standardized reality. They feel oppressed precisely because this reality has never existed and will never exist. There is no singular normality, stability, or comfort. What they really want is to conserve what they believe the world should be. And this pluralism, this diversity of opinions about what the world should be, is each entirely encompassed by the conservative ideology as singular and homogeneous. Conservatism consumes its believers and tells them that it's the leftists that's preventing the normal and real reality from coming about. Whatever your definition of normal reality is, in the end, the conservative is really just in a world they can't understand nor cope with, adapt to. It doesn't matter what the so-called truth is, they just need to express themselves. And again, as Big Joe analyzed, comedy is one such way they do this, using comedy as a mere excuse to say their opinions, their disillusionment with the country they're supposed to love. Comedy to them is not an art form. Likewise, politics is utilized as spectacle. The world is not understood through these mediums. The medium defines the world. It needs to. It has to. Capital is external to ideology itself. Everything it does is already mortal, already realified, as in capitalist realism. It does not need to blast the destiny of society from state speakers, hold parades to demonstrate the concreteness of that destiny. The capitalist destiny exists as itself, as the unspoken symbolic order upholding all that is civil, annihilating all that is obscene. No protest may oppose it, no voice may reveal it, no action may destroy it. It is pure ideology, pure cynicism, and pure reality. What conservative perceives as the real reality is always what is within the limits of capital, of the normal. Capital does not justify its existence before the people. You justify yours before capital. It is seen in its eyes, in its institutions, its processes of production and assimilation or reflection of oneself, and thus petrifies the subject as such. For to act against that reflection, against your own ingrained capitalism, is to act against yourself. A conservative must not reveal where their reality and thought derives, committing self-harm by throwing themselves into a cruel and incomprehensible world by facing a Lacanian real, the traumatic truth. And so the student continues their education as such, afraid to touch what is only meant for God, the shaping of souls, and the institution disguised as a human soul, as autonomous, and as the cultural soul of society itself. The students are delayed in the realization of the fact that capital is not all-seeing, and our capitalist reflection is not really ourselves but construct of said system, because it precisely presents in a totalitarian manner the necessity and goodness of education. 43. Quote, does not the threat of an atomic catastrophe which could wipe out the human race also serve to protect the very forces which perpetuate this danger? Unquote. So opens the introduction to the first edition of One-Dimensional Man. There's always a country threatening American values to imperialize. From the artificial political world of anti-communism or some other threat like terrorism, the other forms of control are solidified. Comfort is created so that no matter what, we can always say communism is evil, the Western way of life is validated. Mechanisms of control are solely associated with communism. Capitalist exploitation is projected onto the ideology, making considering capitalism's exploitation impossible. All projections. What the fuck? Okay.
Same goes for Iraq under Saddam, North Korea, China, Russia. It's all projections of Western totalitarianism on much weaker countries, save for China, because although their power is nowhere near the US, they might actually become an effective counterbalance in the future. As Perenni analyzed in Inventing Reality, the media serves to pacify the masses, simplifying issues and making a spectacle out of politics. It is natural that people are, to put it bluntly, stupid. It is natural they don't understand Soviet history or socialist resistance. It's simply more comfortable to continue listening to the same channels. The world is consumed by media, who tells you endlessly that it is the only medium of communication.
When the printing press was invented, information became controlled and generalized. As local businesses were overrun by mass manufacturing, advertisements became more valuable as consumerism grew, due to the American Civil War taking away the man of the house. Printing techniques that allowed flashy images on newspapers became widespread. 44. Working class papers that advertisers averted from because the poor don't have money to buy things with went out of business. The press became more and more easily consumable and less informative. The reign of mass consumption and mass media had begun. Quote, as wagons and trains moved west and steamers traveled north to Alaska, businesses turned to magazines as well as newspapers to publicize their goods. By the beginning of World War I, long before the rise of radio and television advertising, many brands had achieved national recognition and were available on the local market. Unquote. There is this inhuman quality to giant productions with massive teams. Many people dislike Mr. Beast because of this. His actions are certainly not inhuman if we ignore his illegal lotteries, but the medium in which it is presented is. The medium says this is not a person, this is not a piece of art, this is capital manifest. A mainstream is created. A formula for media creation is followed. A desire for the subversive and new is then also created and then satisfied. Movies subvert traditions, then they become classics. A rapper starts on the ground, then they become celebrities, even if they have leftist tendencies or so-called conscious rap. The forces of the market are inescapable. Save for a few artists, many definitely do actively resist being assimilated into capital. Today we recognize media for what it is because the modern age is overrun with media that is mere media. And yet, despite knowing that we're doing it, we're still doing it. We continue to scroll. Shows, movies, and documentaries are all recreations of already existing culture, or in Adorno and Horkhiemer's words, the world is expected to be the same as the movie. Quote, the whole world is passed through the filter of the culture industry, the familiar experience of the moviegoer who perceives the street outside as a continuation of the film he has just left. Unquote. Culture is an extension of capital, another instrument by which it uses to further itself for no particular end. Quote, once a member of the audience could see his own wedding in the one shown in the film. Now the lucky actors who won the lottery of capitalism on the screen are copies of the same category as every member of the public. Now any person signifies only those attributes by which he can replace everybody else. He is interchangeable, a copy. As an individual, he is completely expendable and utterly insignificant. Unquote. Quote, by excluding non-conforming faces in movies, life is made easier for moviegoers. They are assured that they are all right as they are. Unquote. Reproduction of the same homogeneity is ingrained into the consumer audience, and any effort to do otherwise would be useless. Homogeneous media is the vitality of the consumer. Capitalism can only reproduce itself, reinforce the same system of profit, the same traditional values. To do something new would be suicide. The corporate owners of media know nothing except their bottom line. This video is too homogeneity because let's be honest here, most people watching aren't going to subvert shit. When something gets popular, its message is lost, unless it's a bug because people actually pay attention to bugs. The busyness of modern life and tiring jobs, misinformation and overabundance of information, watching in comfort is a lot easier. Quote, the products of the culture industry are such that they can be alertly consumed even in a state of distraction, unquote. In fact, they are better consumed in the state of distraction. This video is not proper academic work, it's a fucking YouTube video. Consume it mindlessly. The state of distraction is especially prevalent in political media, which makes obvious what is already widely known, that politics is a business like everything else in America. Politics has long since become spectacle. It is a theme park ride with the same surprises at every turn, and in the theme park ride there is nothing but distraction, for there is no longer reality to be distracted from. Everything is fantasy. Thus again, media is consumed better in a state of distraction, and distracted the consumer invents reality alongside the news anchor, the video game, the movie or show, the same article covering the same trending topic, using the same passive voice to not blame the US or Israel because 5 Palestinians were mysteriously deceased while 10 Zionists were brutally massacred by Hamas terrorists. This article by Frankel, this Renter's article about the horrible anti-Israeli slurs and normal anti-Arab slogans, these CNN articles about the trauma of the genociders. The press is indeed free. Free to deny genocide, free to present the perspective of modern-day Hitler. But don't they also present the other perspective as well? Surely that makes some parts of it free. However, as Prenti wrote, quote, true, these elites do not always appreciate how well they are served by a press that would be less credible and less effective if it were exclusively and more blatantly a propaganda arm of business and government. But this does not mean that the press is free and independent, unquote. The media cheered on the WMD narrative of the Iraq War, but now it pretends it never did. North Korea fear-mongering continues because apparently it's more of a threat to world peace than the US, a world superpower which has ignored international law multiple times. But instead we should fear this small nation on the other side of the world that we have sanctioned and bombed into a third world country. We should also fear China even though we have military bases surrounding it. Other forms of media such as Call of Duty or movies like Top Gun are blatant and unashamedly pro-US military propaganda, and people just accept it as if it's normal. Similarly, military sponsorships on YouTube are done like any other sponsorship. The control of the media is not invisible, but all too visible. Independent media exists wholesale as millions of independent agents of capital. Johnny Harris and Kurzgesagt, for example, get funded because they already agree with business interests. Kurzgesagt states that their sponsors have no influence on their research, meaning that the Gates Foundation already loves their opinion. Adorno and Horkhiemer used the example of the radio, which is simply meant to be listened to. You cannot reply to the broadcaster. Quote, the radio democratically makes everyone equally into listeners in order to expose them in authoritarian fashion to the same programs put out by different stations, unquote. There are now billions of channels of information, and each one no different than the last. Each one careful not to step out of line. One only needs to read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent or Michael Parenti's Better Analysis, Inventing Reality. Has become increasingly clear. History is static, culture no longer develops, time is manufactured, and reality exists only in mass media. But politics is only the most egregious example. To go back to culture as we typically think of it, i.e. non-political, We all know of the endless Disney sequels, the mind-numbing social media scrolling, all of it an enormous repeating sitcom, every show, every movie, the same formula. And it may seem obvious to us now, but as literally every single fucking YouTube video on the culture industry says, this book was written while Disney was still in its golden age. It was written far before US Cold War atrocities and the Middle East meddling. Quote, no medieval patriarch of architecture can have scrutinized the subjects of church windows and sculptures more suspiciously than the studio hierarchies examine the plot by Bao or Victor Hugo before it received the imprimatur of feasibility, unquote. Pre-capitalist art, although restrained by the will of its patrons, usually the church or aristocracy, does not even compare to how controlled art is today. And back then, until the 80s, Hollywood had open censorship because BS about decency or something. Today, censorship is in the form of mass media, what gets the most views. Meaningless celebrity drama, pseudo-minority representation in mass media, bullshit that will never affect your life. Culture wars that make you stay on the worst parts of the internet. Media that is mere media. Repeating itself within its own realm for no other reason than for profit and keep you passive. In short, the culture industry today is social media, which news media and entertainment industries fit themselves into. Before modern times, we could engage with the artists as they were making the art. The storyteller, for example, speaks to a group of people that are physically in the same place and time. Walter Benjamin outlines how the modern viewer experiences a film. Quote, since the actor does not present his performance to the audience in person, this permits the audience to take the position of a critic without experiencing any personal contact with the actor, unquote. Other forms of art in prehistoric times, like sculptures and paintings, couldn't be accurately reproduced like they can today. They were special, one of a kind. Thus, they were often engaging even if the artists themselves weren't physically present. Benjamin explained how prehistoric art, quote, was, first and foremost, an instrument of magic. Only later did it come to be recognized as a work of art, unquote. Art was central to a community. It was magic in a way. It had ritualistic value. Benjamin also commentates on how fascism takes hold of aesthetics for its own gain. Mass art today is now for the masses and it is now political. Progress has made art into a proper system, a proper natural function of civilization. Nowhere on the internet do you escape this function. Standardized, the product achieves heights impossible a few centuries before. Consumption and production is made efficient. A low-effort post, a comfortable comment, another $1 million budget film, a masterpiece indie creation, and obscure personal work. Although the substance differs, its function, its effects on the audience remain static. Mass production has not led to more people experiencing art. Art has finally been divorced from all its prehistoric qualities. It is now reified. This Lukacs quote gains another dimension. Its basis is a relation between people that takes on the character of thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity. Art as a commodity is no longer a relation between people. It is purely a commodity in all respects. Its relation is only to that of the capitalist system. No longer does capitalism appropriate the vitality of the proletariat, 45. Now, we are the ones that must borrow art from capitalism. Borrow it in order to simulate the now extinct world of community. Art is simulation of a simulation. Death has not been eliminated or held back through photographs, the internet, and the like. Rather, it has been integrated, as is everything else, into mundane society. Our fear of death has been eliminated through our eager acceptance of it. so that we may work in the factories without too much guilt for wasting our life away. It's alright, we say, because I never had life in the first place. I lose nothing working in this factory. Everything is permanent and preserved through the ones and zeros that hide that there is no longer anything to preserve. What is preserved serves the system, data on consumers, surveillance of workers, history itself. Art no longer decays, it is immortalized as soon as it enters the immortal system of production. Art does not echo and imprint upon the world, it does not die, it does not flow and evolve as it does in our fantasies. It is not humans who direct art, it is art who directs humans. Again, vitality is within capital and we merely borrow it. Our movement, our gestures and activities are derivative of capital. Enlightenment has enlightened time itself, inscribing it into stone, reproducing it in media, constantly feeding capital's insatiable hunger to devour all of existence and beyond. This video is YouTube culture. Its editing, my way of speaking, my references to Mark Fisher. YouTube culture reflects the algorithm. Any large YouTuber has surely sacrificed much of themselves for a sponsor or other. The entertainer needs to be as broadly appealing as possible, and mass appeal means reducing art into a means to an end. In many mainstream cases, art has been reduced to a science, and if not, then their legacy is such. The educator molds their work to be standardized, to cater to the audience, and even Alexander Villa's silent section of his video on Brat is already YouTube, already in the background noise of content, already a relation among things. Art's revolutionary intimacy is at once erased, its challenge already beaten, and the audience sits back and watches. Just let the video play, just let its art decay. The following critiques come from an external position and therefore demonstrates a lack of understanding of the subject. However, I don't then believe that this invalidates my analysis, as the analysis serves to reinforce the theme of non-subversive subversion. Although the idea of romanticism is not inherently bad, it was ultimately a product of the Enlightenment. Romanticism attempts to unalienate the industrial man by a return to nature. Its very opposition is its assimilation into enlightenment. Through creating false opposition, its totalitarian nature is revealed. Its cold indifference towards meaning and being encompasses any remaining life that tries to escape enlightenment. Thought, as diverse as it is, as incomprehensible as it is declared to be too weak of a form of creativity to escape a system which sees nothing other than itself. Enlightenment's eyes duplicate itself once again within Romanticism, surveilling the artist and making absolutely sure they don't stray too far from the society of instruments. The freedom of the artist is society's most reliable chain, the truest form of slavery. The romantic, like Odysseus, cannot see outside of themselves and thus cannot look back at enlightenment. They follow the path they are given, the path of individualism, self-preservation, and thus ultimately profit, and reinforcement of already popular values within the Western tradition. Romanticism is then the conquest of the people who have conquered nature, an indirect conquest of nature to preserve art as corpse. Romantic art is the art of the bourgeoisie. Their intellectualism serves a disconnected elite. Enlightenment values art most of all because it is seemingly the unconquered realm of the working class. It is in fact the most conquered realm, since it is so close and dear to the workers. Even the great mythical depictions of the working class, e.g. the gleaners, stonebreakers, or floor scrapers, though carrying real and actual revolution within them, also serve to preserve the diversity of Enlightenment thought as mere historical artifact. The Romantics, unable to even express such diversity, sacrifice themselves on the altar of profit and the status quo. Liberty leading the people by depicting revolution prevents revolution. In reality, it is depicting the most mundane bourgeois revolution. It has no will to turn its attention towards the people. It is liberty that's leading those people after all. And what is liberty but the state itself who grants such liberty? Not to the colonized peoples and not even to the European peasants, but to the politicians who have never once actually represented the peasants. The working class paintings, in contrast, by depicting the most mundane event, depicts the most revolutionary sentiment. Romanticism, by emphasizing life and the abstract, rejects the Gillian and Marxist notion of internal contradiction. It is afraid of actually analyzing and so appropriates the mere aesthetics of revolution to remain comfortable in its non-revolution, pro-status quo stance. Hippie culture was the pinnacle of liberalism, of the aesthetic of opposition. They were counterculture insofar as it kept their privilege above the blacks and the Vietnamese. Instead of actual opposition like the Black Panthers, hippies merely put up a dystopian symbol of so-called peace. They are romanticists who value the aesthetic of anti-enlightenment more than true anti-enlightenment. Like how fascism is the aesthetic of change while keeping the same capitalist system. The hippie movement tries to unalienate itself through more alienation. White liberals who endlessly attempt to reduce protests to aesthetics. In the early Silicon Valley, its semi-hippie culture complemented techno-capitalism. The propaganda machine History.com writes, quote, Steve Jobs, who embraced Buddhism after a trip to India in the early 70s, conceived the idea of the personal computer as putting computer power in the hands of ordinary people and taking it away from IBM. As Rohrabach puts it, taking computer power away from the giant corporations and giving it to the ordinary people. The author ends with the most haunting statement of the article. What could be more anti-establishment than that? Unquote. Conservatives had Reagan's anti-establishment, liberals had hippie anti-establishment, two sides of the same coin. Non-politics is the most invasive form of politics. It is the attempt by Americans to keep their privilege, their freedom, at the cost of the third world. Forrest Gump, the pinnacle of conservative ideology, demonstrates this attitude, preferring to say nothing about Vietnam than face the truth of American imperialism. The American values of Forrest Gump is to achieve a traditional life and a traditional family, whatever helps you towards that goal. The killing of Vietnamese, Iraqis, Palestinians, the oppression of minorities, the suppression of socialists, those are all rational functions of capitalism benefiting the good and civilized white male. Hippie culture attempts to divorce experience from opposition. You can have non-capitalistic experiences, you can be intimate in the real sense and be liberated from gender and sex, you can annihilate tradition and create humanity without actually having to annihilate capitalism. This comfort of simulated experience without actually creating it through opposition is precisely why the movement was so dystopian and continues to be reflective of modern liberalism. Existentialism, when used carelessly, can also divorce experience from opposition. William Barrett's A Rational Man is itself the void which he accuses society of being. His critique of capitalism is simultaneously crudely stitched together with a hatred of Marxism. and an inadvertent praise of nihilism. He is the man of capitalist realism par excellence. He unifies the void of man with the void of society in a nihilistic spiral towards false class consciousness. Without an understanding of sociology and history, he cannot connect together nature, religion, being, nor capitalism. He cannot understand being. In P45, he recognizes reason as opposed to war and crisis. Reason, he claims, still has a void underlying it. Not being able to recognize the limitations of reason is the cause for despair and tragedy. He fails to make the observation that Adorno and Horkhiemer made a decade and a half earlier, that reason and society is fully in tune, harness the same rhythms as the rowers. War is the pinnacle of reason, of using men as objects. Barrett turns existentialism into distraction. He analyzes insofar as it keeps the status quo. Life is declared not to be enough. Analysis therefore becomes less and less divine, removed from labor, and more theological in the sense of Enlightenment theology, which is the evolution of myth. Barrett said that positivism and Kant claims that merely thinking about existence is unhelpful. There is no difference between thinking about a non-existent thing and an existing thing. They both exist as concepts. Quote, if existence cannot be represented in a concept, Kierkegaard says, it is not because it is too general, remote, and tenuous a thing to be conceived of, but rather because it is too dense, concrete, and rich. Unquote. Existence and the individual, that, Barrett claims, is what Kierkegaard is about. Hegel attempts to reveal the foundations of the Western mode of thought, the tradition of thought, the universal assumptions of thought, and as such, he is criticized for that very act. I, however, follow in the tradition of structuralism, which proposes a different critique. These concepts of existence are already systems of thought. We are not individuals which react to systems. Kierkegaard, the individual, is already Hegel, the system of reason. By this, I mean, of course, the tradition of combining the psychoanalysis of the individual and the macro-Marxist models of society. Today, Kierkegaard is not an individual. He is universalized, popularized. In fact, existentialism itself is commodified. The force of commodification is precisely what drives anti-enlightenment to become enlightenment. The romanticists, hippies, and existentialists commodify themselves and achieve the desirable, non-desiring state of objects, turns into instruments. At last, man is comfortable as a rider of fate, no obligations, no desires, no subversions. The phenomenon of commodification is complex and unique to modernity. To commodify is not strictly defined in my interpretation, as in Marx's fucking C prime M, C equals labor equals means of production by MP to the prime fucking Eminem. I rather see commodification as integration into a system of punishment, into a machine of production. It is the attempt to force the artist to commit suicide through inventing a new system of symbols, a symbolic order. Another screen to cover the Lacanian real. That ideological screen is then declared to be the pure reality. Art as conscious perception, as interpretation of reality, is annihilated in favor of absolute truth as industrial reality. This new form of art, this new interpretation of reality, which declares itself to not only be an interpretation but truth. Capitalism is truth. Camus's question of suicide in the myth of Sisyphus is not an a priori judgment of reason. Rather, it is a result of modern thought, which infects history and declares it all to be relevant to modernity, i.e., it assumes everyone in history considers the same question of modern suicide. similar to how capitalism considers itself, industrialization and enlightenment, as inevitable natural progress. Existence is in reality before life. You exist and then you live. You exist as a subject, then you are born. What suicide negates is not literal life as it is seen and felt. Instead, it is more related to psychoanalysis and the big other. Suicide is the consideration and questioning of desire and of being a subject under capital. Having the fantasy of being born without actually remembering it, i.e. assuming existence, identifying oneself against the fantasy of life and hoping to negate it. Sure, Camus does consider the burden of the laborer, yet he cannot see outside of this singular relation of exploitation. That is because Camus has little interest in investigation. He takes all experience at face value. In other words, his philosophy is an anti-philosophy, which inevitably becomes anti-enlightenment and is thus true enlightenment, stripped of excess. Camus can be humorously seen as Odysseus who faces the challenge of meaninglessness and in the interest of himself for no other reason than himself contributes to capitalism's self-preservation and rationality. Modern stoicism or toxic masculinity at last removes the thin veil of anti-enlightenment, rendering its believers as pure subjects without excess. It is a feverish complacency. The modern Stoic is also the modern Cynic. Both transform an ancient individualist philosophy into its natural progression, a universal Enlightenment ideology that says nothing new. The self-help industry exists to put a brand on everyday thought. The French existentialist celebrity culture has given way to mass-produced advice. This brings me to my next point. Although I don't think any reasonable person actually believes this, some naive young children still might. The attitude around philosophy is manufactured through things like the self-help industry to be disconnected from the world. Philosophy is that complicated subject intellectuals dabble in their dark, damp rooms. Philosophy considers the whole of humanity because the subject is the grand evaluation of the universe itself. Philosophy is then standardized, generalized, and restricted to a specialized task in the conveyor line. It is indeed made to be as broadly appealing as possible. Philosophy is the water we swim in. It is God, which is everywhere, but at the same time, because it is complex, is concealed. Philosophy without politics is a special kind of fiction. It is not only fiction in the sense that it is mere thought. Philosophy is not statistics or facts. Non-political philosophy is ideological fiction. Pure metaphysics, a crude idealism analyzing, for example, death on its own as an idea, creates pure ideology, pure distraction. The popular channel Exubera, for instance, mass produces a politically uneducated, philosophically vague style of storytelling to create the illusion of depth that the alienated, shallow neoliberal world is desperate for. Self-help philosophy precisely tries to make us accept alienation as a higher state of being. Once you understand the human condition, who cares about genocide in Ethiopia? Who cares about rising anti-immigration sentiment? Alienation as complete understanding is the end goal of the neoliberal grind set. Philosophy is made to be standardized escapism, a means to an end. Now, this is of course not to say that actual philosophy doesn't exist on social media. I'm sure the other half of the internet population who aren't brain-rotted children understands what philosophy actually is. Not everyone is watching Jordan Peterson or the School of Life or PragerU. Not every leftist is worshipping the horrible takes of today's Zizek beyond his best works. What, in my opinion, is the problem is that deep philosophical discussions aren't married with politics. Sure, reclaiming philosophy isn't exactly the most vital issue. I actually think reclaiming gender and sexuality as a phenomenological experience under capitalism is more meaningful and significant. But it's the general attitude I'm focused on, because philosophy is everything, right? The attitude towards philosophy is the attitude towards protest and subversion. Anyway, this has been an extremely long-winded way of saying basically subscribe to Philosophy Tube. That's my entire point. Some lesser known channels include The Canvas and Studio Erstats. This was a giant promotion segment, so go subscribe, consume, feed the social media machine, evolve capitalism even more, and accelerate our inevitable extinction. Within AI-generated art is finally revealed to be nothing more than pixels on the screen. Its depth is worth less than a glance. The effects of AI art are nothing new, it's just another repeat of endless capitalist system. Nothing revolutionary has happened other than the insignificant fact that we gained a new visual medium. African children will still work in the mines to produce the hardware which makes AI possible. People will still die in meaningless wars spurred on by global politics and economics. Even before AI, our data was already being mined and collected to make us less human, to make more cogs. Nothing new can arise no matter how extraordinary, even if we make AI behave exactly like a human. Ultimately, it's just the gurgling up of dead history, of already happened, the endless repeat of capitalist mechanisms. AI being a black box illustrates this truth of the means to an end mentality of capitalism even further. It doesn't matter if the AI is actually intelligent, as long as it seems so. It doesn't matter what the human experiences as long as they keep producing. Humans themselves are already a form of artificial intelligence, artificially produced by the forces of capital and culture. Quite fitting then that AI is trained on human work, which is also filtered by barely paid human workers. Amazon Turk was named after a Turkish machine that supposedly was able to play chess, but in reality, a person was just operating a machine from inside. That's precisely what makes it a machine, the fact that a person operates it from behind the scenes. The person is the machine. The person is the artificial factor, while the cogs which enact the laws of physics are the natural factor. When everything is utilitarian and domination expands over the entirety of the world, humans become the world. There is no longer any distinction between the soul and physical objects, metaphysics and physics, art and AI art. Algorithms already infect every part of life. Reality is already artificial. AI learning is just a small contained version of this behavior of capitalism. AI serves as a symbol of what everyone already knows, but is too passive to do anything about. La legge is that truth which exposes itself only as trauma and not liberation. It is the duty of the socialists to transform these things into creation and negation, into real action, class consciousness, and mass education. Take advantage of social phenomena to organize and create. Quote, referring to Marxist metaphysics, paramount here is the fact that social reality is seen as the ultimate criterion for the social existence or non-existence of a phenomenon. The practical social function of certain forms of consciousness, irrespective of whether they're true or false in a general ontological sense. Unquote. Here we begin to understand capital more intimately, how it affects us on a metaphysical level, what is its social nature, what is its idealistic function, in short, being and capital. Quote, Since the railroads were at the heart of commerce, their needs were often given primacy, but no one at the time would accept the radical idea of changing local time into standard time, unquote. Quote, "The timetable is an old inheritance. The strict model was no doubt suggested by the monastic communities. It soon spread. Its three great methods, establish rhythms, impose particular occupations, regulate the cycles of repetition, were soon to be found in schools, workshops, and hospitals. There is a precise distinction between time as social control in feudal eras compared to capitalist industrial eras. Time itself is quantified, systematized, like everything else, and it is no longer just a method of social control but entirely and obviously socially constructed, has become a capitalist realism ingrained into society, accepted as such, and like money, recognized worldwide, conscious or unconscious, as socially constructed. Time becomes more than just control but realized totalitarianism in perfected form. Nowhere can we cease to feel time, and so it becomes a form of surveillance in the metaphysical world, transcending the physical. And I think we all feel this, especially with minimum wage dead-end jobs, as a consequence of being able to see, touch, and smell time as parts of our regular routine. We fear its immensity, we fear its inescapability, but ultimately we fear the system that produced it, manufactured it, as if it was another tradable commodity. Who is this other that stops and starts reality at will? And that, I think, is precisely what Marx was trying to convey. Wage labor is the selling of constructed realities and constructed human beings, all fetishized, magically put into a single object. Time as constructed reality is another product of brutal efficiency. Every second must be used for production and commerce. For that second is bought and sold. That second is owned. That second fits neatly into all the other seconds. Humans must recognize this and regulate themselves as such. Study and usage of time becomes second nature. Quote, "Power is articulated directly onto time. It assures its control and guarantees its use," unquote. It is then made clear, capitalist realism is not fear, it is the inability to feel fear in the first place. Time under capitalism is not a free-flowing idea, it is structured and controlled by the clock, jobs, calendars, schools, military regiments, and so on. When schedules are set, when there are the constant cyclical concepts of, quote, day and night, weekly work and weekend rest, and the cycle of harvest festivals, holidays, and vacations, unquote, our lives are then restricted to such concepts. Our conception of time is thus dictated by capitalism, and nowhere is there escape, neither leisure nor productive time. Time itself is repeated and thus predicted. Christmas must always be an opportunity to increase sales, and it is repeated year after year as such. Quote, "The fetishization of time-saving products and services so sought after by contemporary society, whether in the increasing speeds of cars, the speed and convenience of online shopping, pre-made or instant meal replacements, and the explosion of fast food restaurants, all contribute to the increased time spent consuming images," unquote. Time as commodity alters time itself. Our experience of it, drugs and alcohol make it go faster or slower, and as the board mentions, now we have time-saving products, and also distraction from time, media, commodifying, controlling leisure time. Time is sold to us in the form of clocks and schedules, when to labor and when to consume. The most mundane of tasks is the very adhesive of the whole. It is what makes up the system. The more mundane the task, the more weight it bears. Society weighs down most when you do not see it. Every change in the smallest of details has already been premeditated, because nothing must be out of the ordinary, out of our disciplined routines, which has been optimized for efficiency. Mindless jobs might make the cycle more obvious, but we've been living the same day since we were born. Quote, a meticulous observation of detail and at the same time a political awareness of these small things for the control and use of men. Unquote. Time as capital becomes a form of inevitability. The flow of capital is the flow of human activity, which is how we experience the flow of time. The psychotic who experiences the future and past as the existing present becomes abnormal, mentally ill, obscene, and obsolete. The linear and logical path for them is the mental world. Such is everything from the military to the school, progressive and predictable. From grade 1 to grade 2, things are presented in linear, rational fashion, a factory conveyor belt with only one path to take, and that path must progress capital, and that path must be rational and must line up with contemporary Enlightenment ideals. The criminal must always be faced with the same concrete future of a punishment adequate to the crime, inscribed in eternal civil law. The laborer must appear at the factory when the bell rings. They must turn this many screws in this amount of time. The next laborer must immediately pick up from the previous. The Ford car is then only able to be manufactured in mere hours. Discomfort in knowing the future is presented as normality, as certainty. Everything becomes stable and static. Because the sun will rise again, the snow will fall, the summer heat will come, and the holiday will repeat. Quote, the disciplinary methods reveal a linear time whose moments are integrated one upon another and which is oriented towards a terminal stable point. Unquote. Climate change isn't negated because it's in the future. In fact, it's happening right now in the present. But because that future doesn't register as part of our homogeneous culture, that future doesn't line up with the fact that the sun will rise again and we will be at work again. Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism recognizes his climate change attitude as the Lacanian real, a truth that is too traumatic to confront. Revolution is prevented by the turning of the future into an ancient artifact, already happened, already analyzed and understood in all its complexity by algorithms far greater than the entire human race combined. The future, however, is obviously structured by the past. Repetition is predictability, so the past is just as commodified and rationalized, if not more so. The documentation of human activity must never be lost. Nostalgia shall be sold. History shall be sensationalized, manipulated, or otherwise destroyed if it's harmful to the US empire. Past cultures shall be exploited for profit. Nothing must exist that is not in a relationship with capital, that is undocumented by capital, that future is undetermined by capital. This is the logic of the Enlightenment taken to the extreme. We today have gone beyond the extreme. Time became manufactured during the Gilded Age, and now has been naturalized as part of everyday life. It has completed its transformation from a product to a metaphysics, to a human logic, a world logic. Time is the perfect example of what the culture industry is. The creation of knowledge, of media, of everyday gestures is Enlightenment's glorious abandonment of all past ideas and phenomenological experiences. We no longer experience death, we no longer flow through time. What is in front of us, our communities, are no longer what is visible. We no longer desire or create as become edible. Instead, all experience is towards the end of Enlightenment logic. A gravitational singularity that bends space-time, so the linear motion of history, life, philosophy all goes towards that singularity. And when at last capitalism has devoured the world, spaghettified every atom to have homogeneous gravity, it then turns its imperialism inwards. And any progress that it had made, secularism, science and healthcare, industrialization and rising quality of life, tolerance and political but not economic equality are all revealed as the thin veils that they are, covering the motives of the merchant class, covering the foundations of liberalism. The so-called progress was made to contribute towards the end of capital, of efficiency, of using the world as a mere plaything. Science becomes the science of controlling humans, analyzing them, killing them, caging them. Religion becomes another useful tool of politicians. Tolerance becomes an opportunity to assimilate more consumers into capitalism. Industrialization offers new methods of exploitation and more efficient ways to genocide. The German camps were the pinnacle of organization. The Palestinian lands are the sweet fruits of industrial warfare. This is the nature of being, how we understand and therefore experience being, only as a function of capital. Dasein is precisely what is understood most fully by the subject as a cog of objects. We're born authentically examining being through our authentic capitalistic lens. We therefore understand all too well what being really is, how time really ticks, how death actually seems to be. We are already consumed by the ideological experience of phenomena and simultaneously understanding its essence as such. To be and to experience is to understand beforehand what that experience means under the social system. We are thrown into a world which tells us that we already existed in this world before we were thrown into it. We're not conscious of something, we don't experience its appearances. It is that something which is conscious of us. It is those appearances of the object, texture, color, smell, etc., which defines our very conception of appearance in the first place. In other words, when the world is made to be a plaything, rather than equalizing humans and objects because of human consciousness, it makes humans less than objects. Objects, i.e. systems, then come to define both their essence and our conception of essence of phenomena. I must then restate my introduction. Capital precedes being. Indeed, this is a very Lacanian/Zizekian take. I am in reality talking about the desire of objects rather than actually analyzing their essence in the Heideggerian or Sartreian sense. However, I believe it is more helpful and more revolutionary to view my analysis in the spirit of combining Sartre and Heidegger with Marx, because psychoanalysis is mere intellectual play. It is extremely pessimistic, perhaps the most cynical worldview in human history, due to its subjectivization of the desiring individual, of the revolutionary individual. It paints us as capitalist subjects who can't resist. In other words, psychoanalysis takes sociological critiques, e.g. law is made universal inside of our minds, and makes them not only a general truth, but absolute truth, in order to explain away the individual's psychology. Therefore, not only is this paragraph not in the spirit of Zizek and Lacan, my entire work is not in the spirit of psychoanalysis. I merely mention it from time to time because I just find it interesting. In the 2000s classic Requiem for a Dream, the movie, chaos is turned formulaic in a linear storyline. No matter what happens in the movie, no matter how creative and absurd the framing and cinematography becomes, the story is ultimately linear and very clearly so. The film has a part 1 and a part 2. The issues it covers: systemic racism, prison, labor, drugs, addiction to media and television, more drugs, mental illness, prostitution, and even alienation from the community and family right in front of you, is used in part 1 to force us to empathize with the characters. They struggle for autonomy in a world where there is none. They're desperately searching for air in family, in romance, in financial stability, in drugs, in television screens, in physical looks, but they're still drowning in an indifferent ocean filled with systemic poverty and violence, and ultimately an uncaring government. In the end, there is no escape, there is no ending where the characters pull themselves up by the bootstraps and overcome massive societal issues. In the second part, Harry and Tyrone end up in prison as drug dealers. Sarah, Harry's mother, ends up in a mental ward. Marion, Harry's girlfriend, ends up as a prostitute. What little autonomy they had before being imprisoned, labeled mentally ill, etc., was already a threat to capital because criminals and such are abnormal. Everything must be subjugated and documented. Every movement of the human, every consequential action must be dealt with before it has any negative consequence to the overall system. The petty drug dealer arrested so they may be exploited for free labor in prison, and those who can't work are discarded. The mentally ill arrested so they don't disturb what is normal and mundane. The prostitute forced to sell their body, the ultimate representation of being a disposable worker. Chaos is illusionary. It pretends to have escaped rational modernity to comfort the masses who have turned insane from the mundanity. Chaos is more than spontaneity. It is a continual rejection rather than an incidental one of the power of capital. A continual rejection of structure and logical progression, and because of that very fact, it becomes a mechanism of capital. Chaos in media becomes the ultimate comforting non-comfort. Chaos in life is especially surface level, merely which way the rock falls, which branch the bird sits upon, but the tree will be cut down, the rock will be mined, and the flow of capital continues inevitably. Chaos in spectacle, such as politics, becomes an actual mechanism of capital, an instrument to produce its desired ends. An excited crowd wondering what will happen next, from which we can extract votes or money from. The function of chaos, or rather the function of time, is therefore building societal structures, linear systems, and processes, perfecting capitalism's subjugation. I count how many days till the weekend. I think everyone does. It's the only confirmation I have that time still moves, that no, this is not purgatory, an endless repeating set of events with no aim, no ending, no moral at the end of it all, and nobody cares. Alienated from the value of time and autonomy to such an extent that this has now just become human nature, and everyone hurries along, and the teachers look out the window, the students pretend to have life. Another 6 hours pass, I'm in bed again waiting for the next day where I'm warded another 6-hour simulation of death. And I'll be working a minimum wage job or 2 or 3 or 4 or 12, and I'll be saying, was there such a term as existence? Was anything moving at all? Was the world animated, and did time flow? And I'm here again, in bed awaiting the next day. This is the ritual of maturity. That much I understand, to be able to waste even more of your life in an even more depressing environment. There's nothing I would enjoy more than nothing, and here it is. Nothing. This video is nothing. No one I'm speaking to and myself constitutes. The universal law is such: if space, property, is a commodity privatized to certain eligible people touched by God's hand, then why can't time? Why can't we chop up time just as we do with space? Hours worked, square foot owned.
I went by your house, what a big mistake. But for a while I thought that I wouldn't break.
In Society of the Spectacle, debord famously rewrote the Marxist line of life as the accumulation of commodities. Commodity has become so abstracted it can no longer take on any comprehensible form. In the age of the internet, we even outsource our consumerism to people on our screens. An artificial life of commodities becomes yet more artificial. If actual infinite growth is not possible, then let continuous abstraction be the new form of infinity. Capitalism is now eating itself, turning its imperialism inwards. When at last the Nazis have killed every non-Aryan, what else is there? Where else can capital expand? Quote, "The spectacle is not a collection of images, it is a social relation between people that is mediated by images." Unquote. Everything is image and representation, even so-called real reality, which separates us from the reality of nature and direct physical socialization. The spectacle takes from the culture industry. It is also the justification for capitalism while being the operation of capitalism at the same time. Quote, "As a mere construction of means without ends, the Enlightenment is as destructive as its romantic enemies accuse it of being." Unquote. Quote, "The spectacle's means and ends are identical. In the spectacle, which is the reflection of the ruling economic order, goals are nothing, development is everything." Unquote. The spectacle is alienation, for it is capitalist mediation between you and life. Quote, "Total denial of earthly life is no longer projected into the heavens, it is embedded into earthly life itself." Unquote. And as the chapter title says, separation has been perfected. Every crowd must now necessarily consist of lonely individuals, each communicating through spectacle. Language as a utility by systems of power is separation. We say Google instead of search. It is every time you take capitalist reality for granted, trying to budget or save, looking at prices, waiting to get off work, this has all become reality. Quote, "The inability of language to adequately describe the spectacle is itself evidence of the enormous development of the spectacle." Unquote. Before, the status quo was kept through the lack of political activism from the peasant class. Now the status quo is kept through the manipulation of political action itself. Quote, "The spectacle promotes a subset of real social activity, creating a false opposition between that which is socially possible against that which is socially permitted." Unquote. Socially permitted, such as the notion of peaceful protest, which in its most extreme form can be seen in liberal Zionism. The board further explains that this point can be expanded through the old myth of the good king. It is not that the peasant class can't revolt, it is that they prefer not to as long as a certain standard of living is provided. As I described before in Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Cinema, he describes this myth as the ruling class connecting with the oppressed to keep the system whole. It is the ruler's right to steal the peasant's vitality. This phenomenon can be seen in the culture industry. The myth is now the good free market, the right of capitalism to integrate the peasant's art into itself. In fact, it is not only a right, but an essential part of the system. Passivity is generated not by a period of good rulership, but constant facades of good rulerships. Constant integration of everything into the system of suffocating, inescapable, and unchanging totality. Ever-changing kings now give way to the constant of capitalism, ruled without ruler. In short, a spectacular society creates totalitarian cohesion. The spectacle is the illusion of cohesion in society as people get more and more atomized and specialized in their individual factories. The spectacle fulfills our desire for solidarity, subversion, and the like. Mark Fisher says that it is subversion done for us on the screen, not in reality. The spectacle even manipulates the limits of desire in the first place. It is the pseudo-solution for everything, for both already existing desires and new desires. As I quoted Adorno and Horkhiemer before, differences are hammered in. Now in the age of the spectacle, differences are the only existing truth. There is nothing to hammer in. In other words, media different is not only consumed in the modern age, it is not only accepted, it is actively recreated by the consumers. The Lacanian desire, 51, for subversion, the new, is to be fulfilled through social media, mediated through the spectacle. What's more powerful than subversion being done for us is pseudo-subversion being done by us. Social media is the pseudo-solution to our need for interaction and significance, and each pseudo-solution is personalized to the individual by mass surveillance algorithms. Passive consumption breeds passive production. From identity politics to celebrity gossip, billions enthusiastically contribute to the culture industry, including myself, as the reproduction of confined freedom. A melting pot of diverse cultures that finally homogenize into the ultimate culture of social media, of capital as means and ends. Uniformity disguised as unification of difference. Capitalism extends its reach beyond any borders, for separation only applies to the masses. Separation is only real as a mechanism of class division. What the spectacle is doesn't matter, and before giving my thoughts on the effects of the spectacle on the commodification of art, I have one critique of debord. I don't really get why he has to call it the spectacle. After all, it's just an expression of Marx's original critiques. And yes, I understand all philosophers do this, including the critical theorists and other leftist philosophers. The culture industry, for example, is in reality just a mashup of Marxist concepts. But usually when a philosopher names something, it is referred back to it. They don't set out to create new concepts in of itself within already extensively researched fields like Marxism, as debord does. Adorno doesn't set out to create the concept of the culture industry. No, the culture industry is founded from the Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is itself founded on Marx. I don't set out to prove totalitarian capitalism, instead I merely expand on Marxism. For capitalism has always been totalitarian since Marx. The spectacle is not a new development, and I'm sure debord knows that, but he claims the concept is the new development. And I'm not so sure that it's that easy to create a concept. If you're not Marx and Engels or Freud, you're at best producing new desire. At best, you're part of the rhizome. At best, you're a body without organs, a plane of possibility and no definite identity, since there are no organs, no mechanisms that make you desire or produce. Therefore, it is a blank slate, a body without organs. Lest you let capital do the producing for you, deterritorializing the structure of philosophy and territorializing the structure of commodity. That is, the spectacle reveals that philosophy is fantasy. This is the commodification of art. It is the deconstruction of one fantasy in favor of another. The formal space of art, or scene of philosophy, becomes the up-scene. This is precisely the atrocity committed upon art by capital, or rather committed upon the fantasies of the individual. Art is at last dethroned as the religious force. Instead, it never was a force at all. It's a false idol, and the artist has worshipped nothing. In layman's terms, art simply has no significance whatsoever. It's meaningless, and not because capitalism produced a lie. Fantasies are the exact opposite of lies, but because capitalism is more real than quote-unquote real philosophy. Capitalistic philosophy is fiction for the sake of fiction, and thus its repetitive, self-justifying mechanism comes to be. Odysseus survives for the sake of survival. It is in this way the concrete becomes concrete, and philosophy becomes false. Philosophy is the deception that Odysseus must overcome to achieve self-preservation, to create fantasy. One must slit the throat of another, drain it of blood, and skin it of its hide, only from the natural organs can the organs of mechanical subjugation arise.
Is that you're always somewhat apart. You spend a lot of time going by too fast in a car someone else is driving and seeing the people through tinted glass, the parents holding up a child.
American and coalition forces in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, to defend the world.
In the book, These Schools Belong to You and Me, Deborah Meyer writes, quote, test scores replace supposedly subjective human judgment with presumably objective numbers. And further in the book, from chapter 5 to page 93, we get a quite depressing story. Meyer's son, Nicky, thought that tests were a method of measuring understanding of a subject, so when he answered questions, he didn't go back to reread because he thought he was supposed to understand the text well enough to answer without rereading. Furthermore, he wrote about why he thought an answer was correct when he suspected that the test maker intended another answer. In short, Nicky believed in basic human decency. He believed that he would be treated humanely by a system that prioritizes individuals insofar as it preserves the system of domination. Nicky's folly was not opposition, but the crime of revealing the truth, revealing the system of assumptions and universalities that structure education. His crime was explaining the joke. It was naming the nameless system. It was acknowledging what was to be in the background of assumptions. It was explaining language, e.g., we don't literally mean what we say. This was ass means that it was bad, not literal buttocks. In short, Nicky's crime was the Lacanian real. It was revealing the system of capitalist production that was supposed to be reified, naturalized, and in the background. The job of the school is to assimilate children into the capitalist machine while convincing parents to be complacent. In the book, Prison by Any Other Name, the authors write, quote, the prison system and the schooling system grew up alongside each other. Throughout American history, schools have served the purpose of sorting children into who will go where in a capitalist society, who will be managers and leaders, and who will be taking the orders. Public schools serve the interests of the state and of neoliberalism just as prison does. Both institutions standardize human behavior. In Dr. Fatima's video, Astronomy Has a Colonial Problem, she extensively goes over cases of censorship of pro-Palestinian sentiments, even the more moderate ones, by universities. As I said before, we never had and never will have any real civil rights under capitalism. Sure, schools can serve as a basis for building class consciousness 50, but the schools themselves are merely agents of the state and the free market. And according to the free market and the state, Israel is good for US geopolitical interests in the region, so who cares if genocide is happening? All we have to do is censor those who are outspoken. School is a flashy commodity exchanged by the state and markets which fund it. Education has always been a means to an end. During the Cold War, anti-Soviet and anti-communist sentiments ran rampant. Socialist organizations like the Black Panthers were often oppressed by the police. Anti-communism was and still is used to justify bigotry like racism and homophobia. Academia did not escape this anti-communist zealotry. Quote, as the fear of Soviet influence, the purging of communists from education commenced. Thanks to the efforts of the government, the Catholic Church, and even the American Federation of Teachers, the impulse extended to the ban on books by frontier thinkers, notably the successful campaign to ban the widely used textbooks offered by Harold Rugg due to the skepticism of anything perceived as morally relativist, unquote. The purpose of education is to, quote, produce informed citizens to combat the Soviet menace, unquote. Only knowledge that's useful to the state, to the capitalist ideology must be produced. No culture and no idea can be outside its sphere. The Cold War rhetoric used in the famous report, A Nation at Risk, dissolves itself into the US war machine. Once the Reagan regime was presented with the ideal Cold War mentality, blindly following the god of capital, they didn't hesitate to provide billions in funding. It was recognized once again, as was during the Industrial Revolution, where children were groomed to work in the factories. Education is vital for replacing the human with the mechanical, the free mind with set systems of knowledge processing, the lively child with the dead worker. In the third chapter of this essay, I don't think I'll finish before graduating high school, To Rape a Corpse, The Real Purpose of Education, I will analyze education in much more depth and point to more materialistic and concrete issues. Education as part of the culture industry is connected to a more traditional Marxist critique, including surveillance capitalism. My personal experiences with education will be in such a context. Chapter 3 will assume you've already understood this chapter and the next, and is ready to apply it to education. But before all of that, I will now close off the culture industry, then begin an exploration in living anti-Oedipally, or in layman's terms, an unalienated life. I suggest you watch my video on the anatomy of a video essay before moving on to Chapter 2, Myths for Comfort. I explain in Anatomy of Video essay the purpose of this essay and how I view it. I'm surprised you're still watching, so I assume you watch my follow-ups. Hence why I'm explaining all of this. Well, it's been a long journey, more than a year of work, and it'll be even more years for the final 100-something pages to be turned into a video. Quote, each single manifestation of the culture industry inescapably reproduces human beings as what the whole has made them, and all its agents, from the producer to the women's organizations, are on the alert to ensure the simple reproduction of mind does not lead on to the expansion of mind. Unquote. The culture industry merely reproduces capitalism's conception of human beings, not human beings in reality, not the people in our communities, and its agents, from the film producers to neoliberal feminists that aim only to become the new rulers, 53, ensure that we are pacified and the culture may only reproduce our minds, so that culture cannot do anything subversive or new. There's no central authority, only the authority of capital, which produces the authority of culture. Fascism and capitalism create domination through both internal and external authority. Fascism has the mythology of the nation-state. Capitalism has the mythology of money and democracy. Both are equally absolute, both supposedly scientifically valid. The secret of the human and the secret of nature that the shaman of the village had sole access to are turned into the secret of pure domination, removed of all excess of spiritual symbolism or anything meaningful. Odysseus is the pure scientific method, absolute efficiency at domination. Meaning and art is turned as well into domination, though a lesser form of it than science and capital. Art is profitable and productive. It is defined, sold, controlled, categorized. Any art that escapes this instrumentalization is invalid, destructive, negated. The function of modern art is not unlike the function of religious art. Quote, if Big Brother comes to America, he will not be a fearsome, foreboding figure. He will come with a press that A. dutifully reports the suppressive measures he is taking to save the nation from internal chaos and foreign threat, and B. gingerly questions whether he will be able to succeed. Unquote. Prenti analyzed how the truth is not altered or created, it is subtly guided and made visible only in parts. Orwell, the bootlicker that he is, reinforces totalitarianism by virtue signaling a non-threat. The sigh of relief at the loss of the Nazis is immediately preceded by the fear of communism. By opposing the return to the myths of the old hierarchical societies, Orwell invents a form of time, wherein the present is dead and the past is the future. We need not consider the present system, he says. We in fact need to worry about a return to the past disguised as a new future. But this claim of a return to the authoritarianism of monarchies is itself another lie. The society of 1984 is not authoritarianism at all, or in fact any real system. It is, and you may find this stupid to say, a fiction. No, it is not only a fiction in the sense that it is a story, it is a fiction in that it is liberal ideology. The past and authoritarianism is imagined, just like how conservatives imagine a magical, normal society. 1984, once again, like liberal ideology and fascism, graces the truth of totalitarian capitalism and reinvents it as totalitarianism, period. And the implication that he's referring to communism. Orwell, who has no real analysis of how objects and subjects flow within the system, becomes a victim of capitalism. It is capitalism that turns his garbage into something ideologically useful for the Cold War. Centrists who hate how 1984 is being used by the right are themselves being used by capital. They analyze things insofar as it is individualist and atomized, because anything macro would reveal the truth of capitalism and destroy its central commodity of homogeneity. The storyteller DJ Peach Gobbler that I mentioned in my introduction, for example, tells stories and analyzes 1984 insofar as it does not create a system of critique, but rather merely implies a system of critique, when the central goal is really just storytelling. The American empire exploits people from the other side of the world, but unlike the movies where there are emperors of galactic empires, there is no emperor of America. Every human is a gear and every gear breathes. At the end of the chapter, there's no central exchange of capitalist realism. Mark Fisher writes, quote, "And it is not as if corporations are the deep-level agents behind everything. They are themselves constrained by expressions of the ultimate cause that is not a subject, capital." Unquote. The culture industry is totalitarianism that hates totalitarianism. It sells fiction like 1984 with a smile on its face. We are the products of capital. We are the ones who line the store shelves who are bought and sold. Escape is moving from one shelf to another, changing the look of your packaging and finding peace within death. Normality consists in being spectators to our own lives. Normality and civility is that which does not exist. If Sartre's freedom in being and nothingness is the nothingness that differentiates consciousness and reality, then capital is that very nothingness that allows you to be conscious and mediates you and the world. This nothingness is fully understood. Being is the series of appearances and effects of capital. It is the phenomena which exists outside of the object. I am reminded of Mark Fisher's reference to Nietzsche and Fukuyama. Quote, "This is the condition of Nietzsche's last man, who has seen everything but is decadently enfeebled precisely by this excess of self-awareness." Unquote. The last man is overwhelmed by what was already obvious. It is known to them that jobs are scarce, there are no social protections in America. If you want subversion, be ready to get beaten and starved more than a normal job already does. Lenin believed he wouldn't see revolution in his lifetime. Many movements in Europe, Hungary 1918, the failed German Revolution, British Labour and the strike of 1926, like the Americans in the Gilded Age, dissolve into nothing. The forces of oppression, state, power, corporate oligarchs, are simply too great. With modern isolation, there is even more reason to believe Lenin that there will not be a revolution within our lifetimes. Resistance is then the ability to admit that these power structures don't form the subject. As long as we continue to say that the subject is constructed by these systems, we will never achieve the subject which produces their own desire, who truly creates an alternative to capitalism. Heidegger pointed out that we view the world as a resource, and thereby humans as a resource as well. He talks about how technology ultimately leads to more technology in an infinite cycle of environmental destruction and dehumanization. Capital, in the context of Heidegger, can thus be understood as the most significant technology of the modern age. Capital controls us more than any other technology because it doesn't only influence us like how the wheel influences how we travel and what we think of as traveling. Instead, capital actively controls, it actively standardizes and dehumanizes. That's its direct goal. Innovations like the wheel only controls our mindset as a side effect of its very invention. Capital's main effect, however, is control. Again, to restate, humans are instruments who constantly reproduce the instrumentalization of other humans. Resistance is thus acknowledging the human, the greatest form of resistance humanity has ever evolved. The most resilient, undying part of humanity is the social. It is a world where creation is the only thing allowed, where new things constantly happen, where spontaneity thrives. Marxism is the attempt to celebrate that aspect of humans. Marxism is the highest stage of social cooperation. Despite social media, despite suburbia, AI can never replicate the social. Right now, AI merely copies, unable to do anything original, and even when AI is able to perfectly duplicate human behavior, it will be centuries before we forget that it's a duplication. Let us not distract ourselves from the essence of Marxism, material analysis. This is not a battle of ideas. Resistance is not merely creating ideas and changing minds, it's actual material change. That's what organizing is about. It's improving your community, it's connecting your community. It's not displaying the superiority of Marxism or its correctness, it's applying it. There is no Marxism without its material basis. It's not a metaphysical idea. You're not doing Marxism by merely preaching. Protest creates not because it spreads ideas, but because it actually threatens to change something material. Government policies, corporate power structure, and increasing wages or job benefits, rights for trans people is not about convincing the conservatives. You can do that, it's not a bad thing, but it shouldn't be the priority. How capitalism misdirects socialists from material analysis is precisely its totalitarian aspect, limiting the realm of discourse and action. The culture industry makes culture absolute, aesthetics over reality. The production process, i.e. reality, is then hidden. People acknowledge capitalism insofar as it is the image of the production process, the imaginary fantasy of it, our cultural references to it. In other words, capitalism is transparent insofar as we are immobilized by the sight of it. Its hope is that we have discarded Marx and Engels and all those who came after them. It is the constant, desperate repeat of its thesis of efficiency and self-preservation in hopes of universalizing it. The bodies that line the path of struggle must not be forgotten. The billions starved, killed at the end of a barrel, worked to death, refused healthcare, bombed, crushed under rubble in a genocidal capitalistic war for profit, burned and nuked, the men, women, and children, the revolutionaries who were hunted down for merely opposing mass slaughter and enslavement of millions. And also the ones who succeeded. The welfare and progress gained both during and after the struggle, the rights of the many ever encroaching, the concessions capitalists were forced to make. our labor rights, civil rights for minorities. Online too, we can take steps to protect privacy and the free spread of information. Demonopolize and use products other than Google. Every failed revolution is a culmination of the desires and efforts of so many, and the depths of so many philosophies. But once more they would sprout with every next attempt. We carry with us a metaphysics, a mode of thought, a way of living, an art piece, both a collage and a universal. The songs as men, women, and children fell. The stories that brought so many to a singular unified effort, wounded and sore, their flesh still sang, not with hope, but with effort, not with optimism, but with understanding and fulfillment, not with blind faith, but with illuminated vision. They touched dimensions and they touched time. Our existence and experience, our freedom and desires, our lives and future exist only in relation to those failed revolutions. No man is free. No man lives until all of the dead are liberated. And only in that process of liberating the dead can life find humanity.